The dawn rises over the Atlantic, soft and gray, painting the sea in silver light. On the decks of Portuguese caravels, sailors pull at ropes stiff with salt, their breath misting in the cool morning air. The ships are small, fragile against the vastness of the ocean, their wooden hulls creaking like old bones. But their hearts are fierce. For beyond that endless horizon lies something no European has ever seen. The unknown coast of Africa, a land whispered of in taverns and monasteries alike. It is the early 1400s, and the world feels much smaller than it truly is. Maps show Africa curling downward only a little before fading into the sea, where dragons and sea beasts are drawn in the margins. But Prince Henry refuses to believe the world ends there. From his base at Sagres, a lonely cliffside fortress overlooking the waves, he gathers the finest minds of his age, mapmakers, astronomers, shipwrights, and pilots. Together, they will drag the known world into the light. Under his guidance, the Portuguese perfect the caravel, a new kind of ship, light and swift, with triangular sails that can dance with or against the wind. It is their secret weapon against the unknown, and with it, they begin to press farther and farther south. The first voyages hug the coast, tracing familiar waters past Morocco. But soon, the land begins to change. The deserts of the Sahara give way to dark forests and winding rivers. The sailors bring back strange tales of golden sands that glitter at sunset, of kingdoms ruled by mighty black kings, of traders who wear jewelry made from the very metal they seek most, gold. These whispers ignite the court in Lisbon. Portugal, poor in land but rich in daring, now sees its path to fortune. The goal is not war, but trade, gold, ivory, and the one thing Europe craves most, spices. And so the ships multiply, their sails white against the dark horizon, their crews driven by faith and by hunger. But the ocean does not yield easily. Many ships vanish into storms, their names lost to time. Others return half-sunken, with men raving of endless winds and roaring waters. The sailors speak of a line, an invisible barrier where the sea boils, where the sun burns too hot, where no Christian soul should sail. And yet, they keep going. In 1434, a captain named Gil Eanes dares to pass the feared Cape Voyager, the end of the world. For a moment, every man on his ship believes they are sailing straight into death. But then, calm. The sea flattens, the wind cools, and the horizon stretches open like a promise. They have done it. They have broken the curse. When Eanes returns to Lisbon, the bells ring across the city. The age of fear is over. The age of discovery has begun. Far below those same cliffs at Sagres, waves crash against the rocks, carrying whispers of what is to come. Empires, oceans, blood, and glory. Prince Henry stands in the wind, staring out toward the horizon. His dream is no longer his alone. It belongs to Portugal now, and from this moment onward, there will be no turning back. By the middle of the 15th century, Portugal's sails have become a familiar sight on the horizon. Each year, new ships depart from Lisbon, sleek caravels with hulls built for speed and sails that billow like the wings of angels. On board are men driven by faith, greed, curiosity, and fear, the four winds that have always carried human history forward. The coastline of Africa unfolds before them like a map being drawn in real time. Every bay, every river mouth, every flicker of light on the water is something no European eye has seen. The captains sketch the shores by hand, their ink running when the waves splash the parchment. And slowly, the blank edges of the world begin to fill with names. Argan, Senegambia, Guinea. At first, these are places of trade and wonder. The Portuguese barter with local kings, offering beads, cloth, and iron for gold dust and ivory. There is peace, for a time. But curiosity soon gives way to ambition, and ambition to possession. The first fort rises on the island of Argan, a wooden outpost in the blazing sun. It marks not just a foothold, but a beginning, the first anchor of empire. From here, Portuguese ships sail farther south each year, chasing both profit and paradise. They find rich rivers filled with crocodiles, forests alive with sound, and people whose languages hum like song. The sailors call them exotic, though they are simply human, living lives as real and deep as those the Portuguese left behind. But the age of innocence fades quickly. The traders learn that gold is not the only thing of value here. Soon, their ships carry a new cargo, people, captives taken in war, traded by local rulers, chained below decks. It begins as commerce, but it will grow into something far darker, a system that will stain the oceans for centuries. The sailors call it necessity. The merchants call it opportunity. The priests, uneasy, call it sin. But none stop it. The tide of empire has begun to turn crimson. Back in Lisbon, the docks are alive with noise. Ships creak under the weight of gold and spices. Markets overflow with pepper, nutmeg, and strange fruits. Maps spread across royal tables like wings. The king, Afonso V, listens to tales of coasts stretching endlessly south and wonders, how far does Africa go? Does it ever end? For the Portuguese believe that if they can sail far enough, they will find a way around Africa, a sea route to the fabled lands of India and the East. To them, it is not only a dream of wealth, but a holy mission to bring Christ's light to the corners of the world, to outshine their rivals, and to write Portugal's name across the oceans. But every discovery comes with cost. For every ship that returns, another is swallowed by the deep. For every fortune made, a dozen lives are lost. The sailors begin to say that the sea keeps its own ledger, and it never forgets a debt. Still, the caravels keep sailing. South of the Sahara, beyond the equator, into waters where the stars themselves seem to change. They follow constellations unknown to Europe, guided by instinct, prayer, and the quiet hope that there is more beyond the horizon. And somewhere, deep within the royal court, a whisper grows louder. If the Portuguese can find the edge of Africa, they will own the road to the world's riches. The wind rises again, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. Ahead lies the curve of a continent, and beyond that, the world itself. The winds grew harsher the farther south they sailed. The sea changed color, from deep blue to iron gray, and the air carried a cold bite that tasted like something ancient. For years, Portuguese captains had followed the curve of Africa, always pushing a little farther than those before them. But the coast seemed endless, a serpent winding on forever. Then, in the year 1488, a man named Bartolomé Dias decided to chase the serpent's tail and almost lost his soul doing it. Dias was no fool. He was a veteran of storms, a man who had stared into the eyes of the sea and refused to blink. But even he could not imagine what waited beyond the equator. As his 3 ships sailed southward past the Congo, the familiar landmarks vanished. The stars above shifted, constellations tilting into strange new patterns. The compass trembled. The waves began to rise higher than any he had ever seen. For weeks, the fleet fought winds that howled like beasts. The rain fell sideways, the sea boiled and heaved. The men cursed and prayed in equal measure, their hands bleeding from the ropes. They lost sight of the coast entirely. For 12 days they were tossed by what seemed like the wrath of the world itself. They thought the ocean meant to devour them whole. And then, silence. The storm broke. The sky cleared. The sailors stumbled to the rails, blinking into sunlight. And there it was, calm, open water. Dias turned his eyes northward and, to his shock, saw land. He had passed the southern tip of Africa without knowing it. The impossible had been done. He named the place the Cape of Storms, for the winds that had nearly destroyed him. But when word reached King John II in Lisbon, the monarch renamed it something more fitting for the new age, the Cape of Good Hope. For beyond that cape lay the promise of a sea route to India, the key to untold wealth and power. Yet Dias's triumph was not without sorrow. His men, broken by exhaustion, begged to turn back. They had proven enough, they said. They had gone farther than any soul before them. Reluctantly, Dias agreed. On the journey home, one of his ships vanished into the waves, swallowed by the same storm that had given him glory. When Dias finally returned to Portugal, gaunt and weary, he was greeted as a hero. The city erupted in celebration. Bells rang from every tower. Priests held mass in his honor. But even amid the joy, the sailor's eyes carried something dark, a reflection of what he had seen. He spoke of an ocean that stretched forever, of winds that tore men apart, of stars that no longer obeyed their names. He had glimpsed the edge of a new world, and it had stared back. The discovery of the Cape changed everything. Now, the route to India seemed within reach. The dream that had begun with Prince Henry's vision on the cliffs of Sagres was no longer just a dream. It was real, and so Portugal prepared for the next step, one that would make history tremble. A man named Vasco da Gama was chosen to finish what Dias had begun. His mission, to round the Cape, cross the unknown waters of the Indian Ocean, and reach the spice kingdoms of the East. Lisbon's shipyards came alive once more. The hammers rang, the masts rose, and prayers were whispered into the wood of every ship. The sea, which had always been Portugal's border, was about to become its empire. The wind shifted again. The horizon called. And beyond it, the world waited. In the summer of 1497, the bells of Lisbon rang again, echoing across the Tagus River as 4 ships stood ready to depart. They gleamed beneath the sun, painted in royal red and gold, their sails emblazoned with the cross of Christ. The people gathered on the docks, merchants, priests, mothers, and kingsmen, watching in breathless silence as Vasco da Gama prepared to lead them into the unknown. The smell of salt and pitch filled the air. Above them, the wind fluttered the royal banner, and the crowd whispered prayers to the Virgin for safe passage. Da Gama, a man of quiet resolve and sharp intellect, was no stranger to the sea. He had studied Dias's maps and learned from the mistakes of those before him. Yet even he could not know what awaited him beyond. The Cape of Good Hope. To sail east meant venturing into waters uncharted, where no European compass had ever pointed and where legends spoke of monsters, whirlpools, and endless seas that boiled under the sun. The fleet, São Gabriel, São Rafael, Berrio, and a supply ship, set sail under the watchful eyes of the city. As the coastline of Portugal disappeared into the mist, Da Gama stood at the prow and whispered a single word: India. They sailed south, past familiar shores, past the Canary Islands and Cape Verde, and into the open Atlantic. The voyage tested every limit of man and vessel. Weeks turned into months. The wind vanished for days, leaving the ships adrift in suffocating heat. Men collapsed from thirst. Salt water turned their lips raw. When the winds returned, they came like fury, snapping ropes, tearing sails, and filling the decks with crashing waves. Still, Da Gama pressed onward. He trusted the stars and his faith in equal measure. By December, they had reached the southern tip of Africa. The Cape of Good Hope loomed before them, wild and unforgiving. Dias's storm still haunted those waters, but Da Gama's fleet, guided by prayer and precision, survived the crossing. Beyond it lay the vast Indian Ocean, uncharted, endless, and magnificent. They sailed north along the coast of East Africa, stopping at Mozambique, Mombasa, and Malindi. The people they met were unlike any the Portuguese had ever seen. Muslim merchants in fine robes, cities of coral and stone, and harbors filled with dhows that carried spices and silk. The scent of cinnamon and clove filled the air. In Malindi, Da Gama met a navigator who changed everything, an Arab pilot skilled in reading the monsoon winds. With his help, they crossed the Indian Ocean in a daring, month-long voyage. In May 1498, after nearly a year at sea, the lookout shouted a single, unforgettable word: land. The fleet had reached Calicut, on the coast of India. The men fell to their knees. Bells rang from the masts. For the first time in history, a European fleet had sailed directly from Europe to India, linking 2 halves of the world that had only dreamed of each other. But Da Gama's triumph came with tension. The local ruler, the Zamarin of Calicut, received the Portuguese with curiosity, but also suspicion. They brought gifts, cloth, beads, and silver, but the merchants of Calicut, used to gold and precious spices, laughed at the offerings. Da Gama realized something profound. To gain a foothold in this world, Portugal would need not only courage, but dominance. Still, when da Gama returned home 2 years later, Lisbon erupted in celebration. Church bells rang for days. Cannons fired from the castle walls. He had done what generations had only dreamed, found a sea route to India. The king greeted him with tears in his eyes and called him Admiral of the Indies. The voyage changed the fate of nations. The old overland trade routes, controlled by Arab and Venetian merchants, suddenly became secondary. Portugal now held the key to the east. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, flooded into Europe, their value measured in gold. And with them came something else, power. The oceans no longer divided the world, they connected it. And so began a new age, when Portugal's flag would flutter across every sea, its forts rising on coasts from Africa to India, from Brazil to the distant isles of the Pacific. The age of discovery was over. The age of empire had begun. The return of Vasco da Gama marked the beginning of something the world had never seen before, a network of power that stretched not across land, but across the sea. The Portuguese Empire did not rule by armies that marched, but by ships that sailed. It was an empire of wind and tide, of harbors and horizons. And its beating heart was spice, that miracle of scent and taste that could turn a handful of pepper into a fortune, that could transform bland meals into luxury and fill royal treasuries with gold. Lisbon became the new axis of the world. From its ports, fleets sailed each spring, their decks heavy with weapons, ambition, and dreams of wealth. They called them the Carrera de India, the India route. Ships left with silver and hope, and returned with cargo so rich the scent of nutmeg and cloves clung to the streets for days. Merchants wept with joy, kings counted gold by the chest, and Europe's balance of power shifted forever. But the seas were not generous. Many ships never returned. Storms devoured them, reefs tore their hulls apart, and the long months of salt and hunger broke even the bravest men. Yet for every vessel lost, another followed. The ocean became a highway of ambition. From Goa to Malacca, from Mozambique to Hormuz, Portugal built a chain of fortified ports, each one a pearl on a string of empire. In Goa, the jewel of the East, the Portuguese built cathedrals with whitewashed walls and towers that rang with bells each dawn. Traders from Arabia, Persia, and India gathered there, drawn by the riches of the sea. The air shimmered with color, silks from Bengal, porcelain from China, gold from Africa. Priests walked the streets beside soldiers, and both carried the same fire in their hearts, faith in God and in Portugal's destiny. Farther east, Malacca guarded the strait that funneled the trade of the entire Pacific world. Whoever held Malacca held the gateway to China. And so, in 1511, Afonso de Albuquerque, Portugal's greatest conqueror, seized the city after a brutal siege. With that, the empire's reach extended deep into Asia. Forts rose like stone sentinels against the sky, their cannons aimed at the sea. The Portuguese flag now fluttered in every monsoon wind. But empire has two faces, glory and greed. Beneath the shimmering surface of prosperity lay shadows. Trade soon turned to monopoly. The Portuguese demanded tribute, controlled prices, and punished rivals with fire and steel. Coastal towns were bombarded, ships seized, and rebels hanged from masts. Yet even those acts of cruelty carried a strange kind of order, a belief that they were chosen by divine right to rule the seas. Back in Lisbon, the royal court glowed with splendor. Palaces overflowed with ivory, pearls, and exotic birds. The Casa da India, Portugal's trade office, kept meticulous records of every spice and jewel that entered the port. Scholars drew maps of newfound lands, and poets sang of the glory of the empire. They called Portugal the seed of the world. But beyond the songs and the silver, the ocean whispered a truth. Every empire that rises from the sea must one day be swallowed by it. For now, however, Portugal stood triumphant. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans had become its twin kingdoms. Its explorers had drawn invisible lines across the globe, routes that connected continents, cultures, and destinies. And while kings and merchants celebrated, the world quietly changed. From the quiet markets of Goa to the rain-soaked docks of Lisbon, the same thought echoed. The world was smaller now, and Portugal had made it so. The empire of spices was not just built on trade. It was built on imagination, the audacity to dream that the edge of the map was not the end, but the beginning. As Portuguese sails began to cover every horizon, another symbol rose beside them, the cross of Christ, stitched in crimson on white canvas. It fluttered not just as a banner of empire, but as a divine mission. For the kings of Portugal believed they were chosen by God himself to carry the light of Christianity to the ends of the earth. In their eyes, trade and salvation were two sides of the same coin, gold and gospel intertwined in the salt of the sea. In every harbor they built, from Goa to Malacca, from Congo to Brazil, Portuguese ships did not arrive alone. With the merchants and soldiers came priests and friars, their robes worn from travel, their hands clutching crucifixes instead of swords. They preached beneath palm trees and in stone cathedrals newly built upon conquered ground. They learned local tongues, baptized kings, and built missions that glittered with the promise of heaven. The Jesuits, the most devoted of all, became the empire's invisible architects. Men like Francis Xavier crossed oceans with nothing but faith as their compass. In 1542, Xavier stepped ashore in Goa, then the brightest jewel in Portugal's crown. The city was a mosaic of voices, Arabic, Tamil, Swahili, Portuguese, all blending beneath the tolling of church bells. Xavier preached to fishermen on the beaches, baptized entire villages, and dreamed of carrying the word even farther east. His journey led him to Japan, a land of order and discipline unlike any he had known. There, he bowed before samurai lords and spoke through translators, teaching the gospel in quiet courtyards while snow fell upon temple roofs. For a moment, it seemed as if faith itself had crossed every barrier of sea and speech. Back in Brazil, Portuguese settlers carved plantations into the lush green wilderness. Jesuit missions sprang up along the rivers, teaching native peoples the ways of European faith and labor. Yet even as the cross was lifted, so too was the lash. Slavery became the dark engine that powered Portugal's new world. Africans were shipped across the Atlantic by the thousands, bound in chains beneath decks that smelled of death and despair. Their suffering built the empire's sugar and gold, a contradiction the priests themselves could barely reconcile. Still, to the men of Lisbon, it was all part of God's plan. The king's motto, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, you will conquer, adorned both altar and armory. In the name of faith, they fought wars, signed treaties, and claimed lands that glowed like stars on newly drawn maps. Yet beneath the triumph was transformation. The Portuguese were changing too. They married local women, adopted new foods and languages, and created a culture unlike any before, a fusion of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Churches stood beside mosques, and Latin prayers echoed alongside ancient chants. Across the empire, people spoke in dozens of tongues, but shared one fate. They were now part of Portugal's world. In the flickering light of mission candles and the smoke of distant volcanoes, something deeper stirred, the sense that empire and eternity were no longer separate. To the Portuguese, they were the same journey, the pursuit of God across an endless sea. But as faith expanded, so did envy. Spain, England, and the Netherlands watched with growing hunger. The oceans were no longer vast enough to keep rivals apart. Soon, Portugal would find its greatest challenge not from the waves, but from men who dreamed of stealing its world. For now, though, the cross still shone bright upon the sails, and the empire still believed it carried both the sword of the king and the light of heaven. By the middle of the 16th century, the world had changed, and so had the sea. What once belonged to Portugal alone was now crowded with new ambitions, new flags, and new guns. From the misty harbors of England to the merchant canals of Holland, men whispered of gold, spices, and the mysterious lands that Portugal had claimed as its own. The maps that had once been Portugal's sacred secret, guarded within the walls of the Casa de India, began to leak into foreign hands. The world was opening, and every kingdom wanted its share. The first shadow came not from across the ocean, but from across the border. Spain, bound by blood yet divided by rivalry, had begun its own crusade of conquest. When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492 under the Spanish crown, he opened a new frontier that would soon challenge Portugal's mastery. To prevent war, the two powers turned to the Pope, and in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, an invisible line drawn down the globe. Lands to the west belonged to Spain, lands to the east to Portugal. On paper, it kept the peace. In truth, it only set the stage for centuries of conflict. Yet for a time, Portugal still thrived. It built fortresses of stone in the east and cathedrals of marble at home. But the cost of empire grew heavier with each passing year. The seas that once made Portugal rich were draining it dry. Ships vanished in storms, trade routes stretched thin, and distant governors ruled like kings, far from Lisbon's reach. The empire's brilliance, once blinding, began to flicker at its edges. Then came the Dutch, merchants turned warriors, driven not by faith but by profit. They envied Portugal's monopoly on spices and sea routes, and sought to seize it piece by piece. Their ships, swift and well-armed, struck like shadows. One by one, Portuguese ports fell, first in Africa, then in Asia. Malacca, Ceylon, and the Moluccas burned under cannon fire as the Dutch East India Company rose like a storm. From the west came another threat: England, whose explorers and pirates prowled the seas under royal commission. Men like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh attacked Portuguese and Spanish fleets alike, plundering their holds for gold and glory. The ocean that had once been a stage for Portugal's triumph now became an arena of survival. Amid this chaos, fate dealt a cruel blow. In 1580, Portugal's king, Sebastião I, died in a disastrous crusade in Morocco, leaving no heir. The nation trembled. The throne passed to Philip II of Spain, uniting the two empires under one crown. But in spirit, Portugal was no longer free. Its ships sailed under Spanish orders, and its enemies now saw it as fair game. Dutch and English privateers, eager to strike at Spain, attacked Portuguese colonies instead. For 60 long years, Portugal's glory dimmed under Spanish rule. Lisbon, once the beating heart of the world, became a silent capital watching others feast on its empire. But within its narrow streets, in the quiet murmur of taverns and the whispered prayers of sailors, the old fire still burned. Portugal might have lost its crown, but not its soul. When independence returned in 1640, the nation was battered but unbroken. The empire it reclaimed was smaller, bruised by war, yet still alive. In Brazil, sugar and gold promised new riches. In Goa, priests still rang bells over the morning tide. And in distant Macau, Portuguese merchants still traded silk and silver beneath Chinese lanterns. The rivals had come, and many had conquered. But Portugal endured, not through power, but through persistence. It was no longer the master of the seas, but it remained its oldest voyager. And though its empire's edges had frayed, its story was far from over. The age of conquest was ending. The age of survival had begun. When the first Portuguese ships drifted along the endless coastline of Brazil in 1500, it was by accident. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, sailing to India, had been carried westward by the wind, into a land so vast, green, and untouched it seemed to stretch forever. The beaches glowed under a golden sun, and the forests pulsed with life. Parrots, monkeys, and trees that bled red sap the color of flame. They called it Terra de Vera Cruz, the land of the true cross. But it would soon be known by another name, taken from the rich redwood that grew in its forests, Brazil wood, or pau-brasil. At first, the Portuguese saw Brazil as little more than a curiosity, a land too large to rule, too wild to tame. But slowly, the scent of opportunity began to rise from its shores. Traders came for the redwood, then settlers for the sugarcane. Within decades, small coastal settlements became bustling colonies. The Atlantic winds that once carried spices now carried another kind of wealth, sugar, the white gold that would build cities and break souls. The sugar plantations of Brazil were vast, stretching across the coastal plains. The work was brutal, the heat unrelenting. To fuel this industry, Portugal turned to the transatlantic slave trade, bringing millions of enslaved Africans to labor in the fields. Their songs and sorrows became the hidden heartbeat of Brazil, a rhythm of endurance that echoed through centuries. Meanwhile, Lisbon grew rich again. Ships loaded with sugar, gold, and precious stones sailed homeward, feeding the royal coffers and restoring Portugal's faded prestige. Brazil became the empire's greatest prize, its new jewel, its promise of rebirth. Missionaries followed the merchants, raising wooden crosses among the palms. Cathedrals rose over jungle rivers, and saints' names replaced those of native gods. Yet even as churches filled with song, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. The native peoples, driven from their lands, fought back against encroaching settlers. Jesuit priests tried to shield them, but the colonists hungered for more territory. Deep in the forests, runaway slaves built hidden communities called quilombos, secret villages of freedom where drums beat in defiance of empire. The 1600s and 1700s became Brazil's golden age, an age of gold and contradiction. In the mountains of Minas Gerais, miners unearthed rivers of gold, filling Lisbon's treasuries and gilding its churches. The city glittered, but the empire's weight shifted west. Brazil was no longer a distant colony. It was the heart that kept Portugal alive. In Rio de Janeiro and Salvador, Baroque churches gleamed with gold leaf while music and laughter filled the streets. Portuguese nobles arrived with titles and ambitions, while slaves built their mansions stone by stone. From the sugar fields to the coastal forts, the empire's pulse now beat to Brazil's rhythm, hot, humid, and unrelenting. But prosperity came with unease. The colonies were growing powerful, and whispers of freedom began to drift across the Atlantic, carried by the winds of revolution that were sweeping the world. Portugal, weakened by wars in Europe, held tightly to Brazil, knowing it was the last great pillar of its empire. In this lush new world, Portugal had found salvation, but also the seeds of its own transformation. For Brazil was not just a colony. It was becoming something larger, something that would one day eclipse the empire itself. For now, the flag of Portugal still waved above its forts and harbors. The bells of Rio still rang for the king. But in the hearts of men and women born beneath that blazing sun, the old loyalty was fading. They no longer dreamed of Lisbon. They dreamed of home. By the dawn of the 18th century, Portugal gleamed like a polished gem. From the ports of Lisbon, ships laden with Brazilian gold arrived in endless waves. Their holds overflowed with coins, sugar, tobacco, diamonds, and ivory, treasures that dazzled Europe and revived the empire's long-faded pride. The streets of Lisbon smelled of cinnamon and smoke, of roasted coffee and the salt of the Atlantic. Every bell tower sang of fortune, and every noble dreamed of splendor. The king at the time, Dom João V, was called the Magnificent. Under his reign, Lisbon became a city of marble and miracles. He poured Brazil's gold into the construction of cathedrals and palaces, each one grander than the last. The Agua Livre's aqueduct, stretching for miles across the hills, carried water like a river of silver. The Mafra Palace, his most extravagant creation, rose from the earth like a monument to divine excess, a royal city within walls of stone and glory. Inside these halls, priests chanted, chandeliers sparkled, and courtiers danced to the sound of imported harpsichords. The empire's wealth seemed infinite. The king believed himself chosen by God to rule over two worlds, one of land and another of sea. His letters to the Pope carried gifts of gold so vast that even Rome marveled at Portugal's riches. But beneath this golden surface, cracks spread like invisible veins through marble. The empire's strength no longer came from its ships, but from Brazilian gold, and that gold was running out. The mines that once glowed with promise began to empty, their tunnels collapsing into silence. The sugar fields were exhausted, the forests stripped for wood, the land scarred by greed. Lisbon's wealth was an echo, its grandeur a mirage. Then, in 1755, came a moment that shattered both stone and soul. On the morning of November 1st, All Saints' Day, the city was alive with prayer. Candles flickered in every church. Then, without warning, the ground began to shake. Walls cracked, towers crumbled, and the earth roared as if God himself had spoken. The Lisbon earthquake, one of the deadliest in history, tore the empire's heart apart. Churches fell upon worshippers, flames engulfed the ruins, and a massive tsunami swept through the harbor, dragging ships and souls alike into the depths. Tens of thousands died. The Golden City was reduced to ash and silence. For days, the survivors wandered through streets filled with smoke, their faces coated in dust and disbelief. It felt as though divine punishment had struck the empire that once called itself holy. But from this devastation rose a new kind of ruler, Marqués de Pombal, the king's minister and a man of reason rather than faith. He rebuilt Lisbon not with prayers, but with precision, straight boulevards, earthquake-resistant buildings, and a vision of modern order. His motto was simple: bury the dead and feed the living. And in that single command, the old Portugal died, and a new one began to take shape. Yet the cost of survival was high. Pombal's reforms broke the power of the church, crushed rebellion, and tightened royal control over the colonies. The empire, once driven by discovery, now clung to authority through bureaucracy and fear. Brazil remained its lifeline, but even that bond began to strain. Across the ocean, whispers of freedom grew louder, whispers that would one day roar. As Lisbon rebuilt itself from ruin, the empire's glory faded like gold left too long in the sun. The marble gleamed, the palaces stood tall, but something vital was gone. The daring spirit that had once chased the edge of the world. Portugal had found its paradise and lost its purpose. The late 18th century arrived like a storm on the horizon, a storm of ideas, rebellion, and restless hearts. Across the Atlantic, the world was changing. Empires that had stood for centuries began to tremble under the weight of enlightenment and revolution. The American colonies had declared independence, and the French monarchy would soon fall to the guillotine. The winds of freedom were no longer whispers. They were roaring across the seas. Portugal, small and proud, felt the tremors from afar. In Lisbon, the echoes of revolution brought unease to the royal court. The empire had long depended on its colonies, especially Brazil, the jewel that glittered brightest among all Portuguese possessions. Its vast sugar plantations, gold mines, and bustling ports fed Lisbon's coffers. Yet, across the ocean, new ideas began to take root, ideas of liberty, equality, and national pride. In Brazil, these ideas mingled with resentment. The colony had grown rich, but it was still ruled by distant monarchs who cared little for its people's voice. Taxes were high, local trade was restricted, and the Portuguese elite controlled the flow of wealth. The Brazilians, born of both European and native heritage, began to see themselves not as subjects, but as a people of their own. Quietly, in salons, taverns, and university halls, the seeds of rebellion were sown. Then came 1807, a year that would turn the empire inside out. Napoleon's armies swept through Europe, and Portugal, refusing to join France's blockade against Britain, found itself invaded. The French marched toward Lisbon, and in desperation, the Portuguese court made a decision unlike any other in history. The king would flee across the ocean. In a massive convoy of ships, guarded by the British Navy, King João VI, his family, nobles, and treasures sailed away from their homeland, crossing the Atlantic to Brazil. Lisbon wept as its monarch vanished beyond the horizon, leaving a ghostly silence behind. When the royal fleet arrived in Rio de Janeiro, the sleepy colonial port transformed overnight into the heart of an empire. Palaces were built, libraries established, and the city became the beating center of Portuguese power. For the first time, a European kingdom ruled not from Europe, but from the New World. The people of Brazil watched in awe as their colony became the de facto capital of the empire. But this strange reversal could not last forever. When Napoleon was defeated and Europe returned to its uneasy peace, the Portuguese court faced pressure to go home. The king, reluctant but weary, sailed back to Lisbon in 1821, leaving his son, Dom Pedro, behind as regent of Brazil. Yet by then, the colony's spirit had changed. Brazil had tasted autonomy, and its people would not surrender it easily. The following year, as Portugal's government tried to reassert control, Dom Pedro made a choice that would echo through history. Standing on the banks of the Ipiranga River, he drew his sword and shouted, "Independencia ou morte," independence or death. It was 1822, and the Portuguese Empire had lost its greatest possession. Brazil was free. In Lisbon, the news was met with disbelief, then grief, and finally resignation. The empire that had once reached across continents was now shrinking. One by one, the old ports, islands, and fortresses that had defined Portugal's might began to fade from its grasp. Yet, even in loss, there was dignity, for Portugal's legacy was not just in conquest, but in connection. The language, the culture, and the faith it had carried across oceans had taken root far beyond its borders. The world was changing, and the old empires were fading, but their shadows lingered on every shore where Portuguese sails had once appeared against the wind. By the middle of the 19th century, the Portuguese Empire stood like an aging ship battered by centuries of storms. Once the pioneer of global discovery, Portugal now clung to scattered possessions: Goa, Mozambique, Angola, Macau, and the distant Azores and Madeira, like a sailor holding to the last pieces of driftwood after a shipwreck. The age of exploration had ended, and a new world had dawned, one of steam, steel, and empire building on an industrial scale. The British and French now ruled the oceans that Portugal had once dominated. In Lisbon, the air was thick with nostalgia. The people still sang songs of Vasco da Gama and the golden days of discovery, but behind the proud words lay the uneasy truth. The world had moved forward, and Portugal had not. Its economy was weak, its navy a shadow of its former self, and political instability plagued the kingdom. Revolutions, civil wars, and shifting constitutions turned the once stable monarchy into a fragile shell. Yet, far away across the seas, the Portuguese flag still fluttered over tropical skies. In Goa, Portuguese churches rose above palm trees, and the faint echo of Latin hymns mingled with the sound of Indian bells. In Mozambique and Angola, traders and missionaries struggled to maintain influence amid growing European competition. For the Portuguese who lived there, life felt suspended between two worlds: the familiar traditions of home and the untamed landscapes of empire. But as the 19th century drew to a close, a new scramble for Africa began. European powers, hungry for resources and territory, rushed to carve the continent into colonies. At the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, Portugal, though small, claimed vast regions of southern Africa, dreams of connecting Angola and Mozambique through a transcontinental corridor. The plan was bold, almost defiant, a flicker of the old imperial fire. However, the dream was short-lived. Britain, seeing Portugal's ambitions as a threat to its own routes through Africa, issued the 1890 British ultimatum, demanding Portugal abandon its plan. The humiliation struck deep. Across Lisbon, protests erupted. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Death before dishonor." Newspapers condemned the government's weakness, and poets turned rage into verse. The national pride that had once carried caravels across oceans now burned as frustration and shame. This moment, the British ultimatum, was more than a political defeat. It was an emotional wound that never fully healed. It awakened in Portugal a realization that the empire's glory days were gone. The humiliation fueled republican movements at home, and within 2 decades, the monarchy itself would fall. In 1910, the sound of revolution echoed once more through Lisbon's narrow streets. The royal family fled, and Portugal became a republic. The empire, though still existing in name, now belonged to a nation that no longer ruled the seas. Meanwhile, in the colonies, change was coming slowly but surely. The world was modernizing. Steamships replaced caravels, and telegraphs replaced messengers. Yet in many of Portugal's territories, time seemed to stand still. In the humid air of Luanda or the quiet harbors of Goa, life went on as it had for centuries, a blend of Portuguese faith, local custom, and the rhythm of the tropics. As the 20th century approached, the empire felt like a relic of another era, beautiful, enduring, but fragile. And though its days of conquest were over, Portugal's influence had seeped deep into the soil and soul of its former colonies. The language, the architecture, the music, all bore the faint but permanent mark of Lisbon's golden age. The sun had set on Portugal's world empire, but its light, scattered across oceans, continued to shimmer, softly, like the reflection of stars on dark water. The 20th century arrived like a tide that could not be stopped. Across Europe, old empires were trembling. Britain, France, Spain, and the Ottomans all watched their dominions shake under the weight of change. But for Portugal, whose empire had once been the first to rise, it would now be among the last to fall. In the streets of Lisbon, revolution had brought a new republic, yet the ghosts of the past still haunted its people. Flags changed, leaders came and went, but the nation could not let go of its ancient dream, that Portugal, though small, was destined to stand tall among nations. And so, even as the world modernized, the government clung fiercely to its colonies, calling them overseas provinces instead of possessions, insisting that they were integral parts of Portugal itself. But in the far corners of Africa and Asia, the winds of independence were stirring. In Goa, Indian nationalists whispered of freedom, inspired by Gandhi's voice rising from the heart of the subcontinent. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, the people began to dream of self-rule, of shaking off the distant hand that had ruled them for centuries. Portugal, under the iron grip of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, resisted. His dictatorship, known as the Estado Novo, promised order and stability but clung to the myth of empire. Portugal, Salazar declared, is not a small country. Our nation exists wherever our language is spoken. He saw the colonies not as burdens, but as the essence of Portuguese greatness. To lose them would be to lose identity itself. But as the decades passed, the world grew restless. In 1961, the first cracks appeared. India, newly independent, demanded that Portugal relinquish Goa, Daman, and Geo, the last remnants of its empire in Asia. Lisbon refused. For 10 days, India's army surrounded the territory. The small Portuguese garrison, outnumbered and isolated, finally surrendered. The empire that had once reached the shores of Japan had now been pushed out of the east entirely. In Africa, the struggle turned violent. Guerrilla movements ignited across Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, waging long wars for independence. The Portuguese soldiers who once sailed for glory now fought in jungles and deserts, not for conquest, but to delay the inevitable. The wars dragged on through the 1960s and early 1970s, brutal, costly, and unwinnable. Meanwhile, back in Portugal, the old empire's weight crushed the home front. The economy faltered, censorship tightened, and an entire generation of young men was sent to fight in distant lands they barely knew. Yet the Portuguese spirit, the same stubborn, proud resilience that had once pushed sailors beyond the horizon, endured. Then, in 1974, everything changed. The soldiers who had been sent to fight in Africa returned home, but not as conquerors. They came back weary, disillusioned, and longing for peace. On April 25, 1974, they laid down their weapons in Lisbon and filled the streets with carnations, red flowers, not bullets. It became known as the Carnation Revolution, one of the most peaceful uprisings in modern history. The dictatorship fell, and within a year, Portugal began to let go of its colonies. By 1975, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau had declared independence. The Portuguese Empire, after more than 600 years, had finally come to an end. But even as the flags changed and the maps were redrawn, Portugal's legacy refused to fade. The Portuguese language remained alive, from Brazil, where it thrived as the voice of a vast and vibrant nation, to Cape Verde, Angola, Mozambique, East Timor, and beyond. The echoes of Portuguese architecture still stood in Goa's whitewashed churches, in Macau's cobbled streets, and in the melancholic rhythm of fado music, sung by voices that remembered the sea. The empire was gone, but its soul had scattered across the world, woven into the cultures it had once touched. Portugal, once the pioneer of the global age, had left behind something more enduring than power, a shared language, a memory, and a story that stretched from the Atlantic to the edge of the Pacific. The empire's sails had finally lowered, but its echoes, soft, eternal, and full of saudade, still drifted across the sea. When the empire finally faded into the pages of history, Portugal did not vanish with it. Instead, like the tide pulling gently back from the shore, it left behind quiet traces, stories whispered in the salt air, melodies that lingered over the Atlantic, and faces that carried the blended heritage of continents once connected by its ships. In the calm evenings of Lisbon, the Tagus River still glimmers gold beneath the setting sun, just as it did centuries ago when caravels prepared to set sail. Tourists walk the same cobblestone streets where sailors once prayed before their voyages, and the same breeze that filled their sails now rustles the red rooftops. The empire is gone, but its memory hums softly in the air, like a lullaby carried by the sea. Portugal's greatness no longer lies in the size of its dominion, but in the depth of its identity, in its language, its art, and its timeless spirit of discovery. The people call it saudade, a word that cannot be translated, only felt. It is a longing for something that has passed, but also a gentle acceptance that beauty often lives in what is lost. Saudade is the sound of the ocean at dusk, the taste of salt on the wind, the memory of sails vanishing into the horizon. It is Portugal's truest legacy. In the 21st century, the world that Portugal helped connect is now bound tighter than ever by technology, by travel, by trade. Planes cross oceans in hours that once took ships months. Yet the essence of that first great leap into the unknown still stirs within human hearts. The same daring curiosity that sent sailors beyond the edge of the map. Across the Lusophone world, the Portuguese language unites hundreds of millions, from the laughter in the streets of Rio de Janeiro to the markets of Luanda, the music of Maputo, and the distant islands of Cape Verde and São Tomé. It is as if the empire, though long dissolved, transformed into a shared family of voices scattered across the seas. A living reminder that ideas, unlike empires, do not fall. They evolve. Back home, Portugal has embraced peace with a quiet dignity. The nation that once looked outward now looks inward, toward preservation, culture, and memory. The great age of discovery has become not a tale of conquest, but of connection. Museums honor the explorers, but also the people they encountered. The monuments along Lisbon's waterfront stand not only as symbols of power, but as invitations to reflect on the vast, complicated legacy of exploration, the courage and the cost. And as night falls over the Atlantic, the sea remains unchanged. The waves still whisper against the rocks of Belém, where statues of explorers stand watch beneath the stars. In those waves, you can almost hear them, the faint rhythm of drums from Angola, the distant bells of Goa, the echo of prayers in Brazil. Fragments of an empire scattered across time, carried endlessly by the ocean that both created and consumed it. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine standing on that ancient shore, the wind in your hair, the scent of salt and cedar in the air. The ships are gone now, but the sea remains. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the ghosts of Portuguese sailors still chase the sun, their sails glowing softly in the twilight. Because some journeys never end. They simply become stories. And this was the story of the Portuguese Empire, the dream that dared to cross the world, and the memory that will forever belong to the sea. Long after the cannons have fallen silent and the flags have been lowered, the ocean still remembers. It remembers the laughter of sailors departing Lisbon's harbor, the thunder of waves against wooden hulls, the distant songs of foreign shores that once echoed through the night. The empire is gone, yes, but the sea has kept its memories like treasures buried beneath the tide. If you walk today along the docks of Belém, where stone monuments rise like frozen sails against the sky, you can still feel the pulse of that history beneath your feet. The marble carvings of Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan stand proudly, their faces turned toward the horizon as if they still search for something just beyond sight. Yet the silence around them feels heavy, not with triumph, but with reflection. The world they helped to shape was vast and wondrous, but also scarred. In the quiet of dusk, the Tagus River glows like molten gold. The water slides past slowly, as if it knows the weight of centuries that have passed above it. Once, this river carried fleets toward the unknown. Now, it carries the reflections of streetlights and the faint hum of the city that grew from those voyages. Lisbon remains both modern and ancient, a city where trams rattle through narrow lanes lined with azulejos, and fado singers pour their souls into the night air, their voices trembling with that eternal feeling of saudade. That word, saudade, still defines the Portuguese heart. It is not just sorrow, nor just nostalgia. It is the ache of memory, the sweetness of what has passed, and the peace that comes from knowing it will never truly return. It is the ocean's own emotion, eternal and shifting. The Portuguese Empire may have fallen, but saudade remains, its invisible monument. And so, even as Portugal became a quiet nation on the edge of Europe, its stories never stopped traveling. The children of its empire grew into nations of their own, carrying fragments of Lisbon's soul. Within them, the rhythms of Brazil's samba, the poetry of Mozambique, the cuisine of Goa, all bear the fingerprints of a long voyage that began with a dream of reaching the world's edge. In a way, the empire did not end, it transformed. It became something softer, more enduring. A network of cultures bound not by force, but by memory and language. The Portuguese-speaking world, the Lusophone community, stands today as the living legacy of that once great maritime dream. Millions of people, separated by oceans yet connected by words, music, and spirit. Every year, ships still cross the Atlantic, not with cannons or spices, but with families, ideas, and stories. Portuguese sailors once mapped the sea. Now their descendants navigate the waves of culture, art, and emotion. The empire's gold is long gone, but its true treasure, its humanity, endures. And somewhere out there, perhaps in a quiet corner of the ocean, a fragment of a Portuguese ship still rests beneath the waves, its timbers wrapped in coral and time. If you listen closely, you might imagine the echo of a voice calling through the deep, the voice of a sailor whispering a prayer before dawn, asking only that his story be remembered. Tonight, as the world sleeps, the sea remembers him. It remembers them all. When the world grows silent and the sea turns silver beneath the moon, the old navigators awaken, not in body, but in memory. Their statues stand still in daylight, carved from stone and salt. But at night, when the wind whispers across the Atlantic, you can almost sense them stirring. The dreamers of the past, Henry, Vasco, Magellan, and countless unnamed sailors, rise once more in the imagination of the waves. They are not ghosts of conquest or empire now. They are wanderers of the soul, drifting through time, watching the world they helped weave together. From the mists of the Tagus to the shores of Brazil, from the temples of Goa to the harbors of Macau, they drift, unseen but ever present. Their journey never truly ended, it only changed form. Prince Henry the Navigator sits upon the edge of a cliff, staring into the horizon that he once dreamed to conquer. In the quiet of eternity, he no longer seeks maps or gold, but understanding. His heart, once filled with the fire of discovery, now beats with the rhythm of the tide. He sees how the lines drawn on maps long ago became bridges of culture and scars of memory. Vasco da Gama, the bold sailor who first reached India by sea, walks the ghostly decks of his ship, listening to the sound of distant waves. The same waves that once carried him to Calicut now carry whispers of modern ships, airplanes, and satellites, machines that trace the same routes he once mapped with nothing but faith and stars. He smiles, faintly, as he realizes that humanity's thirst for discovery has never ended. Only the tools have changed. And Ferdinand Magellan, who died before completing his circumnavigation, drifts eternally around the globe. His spirit circles the world he once proved was whole. Where others saw limits, he saw the curve of possibility. His name, carved into history, now floats like a constellation over the seas he once crossed. Together, they are no longer explorers of geography, but of memory. Their voyage now sails through time itself, carried by stories, songs, and whispers that reach every corner of the earth. They listen to fado singers on the banks of the Tagus, to Brazilian musicians strumming gentle rhythms in Rio, to children in Mozambique reciting Portuguese lullabies beneath tropical skies. Each voice is a star in their endless night, proof that their journey was not in vain. As dawn approaches, the navigators fade once more into the sea mist. The waves roll softly, wrapping their stories in foam. The ships that once bore their flags are long gone, replaced by new vessels, not of war, but of connection. Airplanes trace their routes in the sky where gulls once flew, cables beneath. The ocean carry words instead of cargo. And perhaps, if you stand on the edge of the ocean in the quiet hours before sunrise, you might hear them. A whisper in the wind, faint and distant, but clear enough to stir your heart. The words are ancient, yet timeless. Go beyond, always beyond. That was their creed. The spirit of exploration, not for empire, not for conquest, but for wonder, is their true inheritance. As the light of morning spills across the Atlantic, Lisbon awakens. The sun touches the monument to the discoveries, casting long shadows of sailors, poets, and kings across the marble quay. The city breathes, alive with both memory and hope. The ocean glitters like liquid glass, endless and inviting. And though the navigators have long since vanished into history, their dreams continue to sail. In every voyage, every curiosity, every human heart that dares to look at the horizon and whisper, what lies beyond? The first light of morning rises gently over Lisbon, spilling gold across the red-tiled rooftops and the glistening Tagus River. The city stirs not with noise, but with the sigh of the sea breeze brushing against ancient walls. Seagulls cry faintly in the distance, circling the white towers of Belém, and for a moment, it feels as though time itself hesitates, caught between memory and awakening. Lisbon is not a city that forgets. Every cobblestone seems to remember a story, of ships setting sail toward the unknown, of lovers waving farewell on the quays, of poets watching the horizon with tears in their eyes. The scent of the ocean still lingers in the morning air, mingling with the aroma of fresh bread from small bakeries and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts from the early vendors. The monument to the discoveries casts its long shadow across the waterfront, stone figures forever gazing toward the west, toward the vast blue that carried their dreams. Tourists pass by, taking photographs, unaware of the quiet hum beneath the marble. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of creaking ropes, fluttering sails, and distant hymns sung by sailors at dawn. It is as if the sea itself hums in remembrance. Up the winding streets of Alfama, where the houses are painted in soft pastels and hung with laundry that flutters like sails, an old woman waters her plants while humming a fado tune. Her song is low and filled with saudade, that untranslatable Portuguese longing, a mixture of sorrow, love, and endless yearning. It is the soul of the Portuguese Empire distilled into melody, the ache of distance, the beauty of loss, and the quiet pride of endurance. Children hurry to school, carrying backpacks instead of compasses, but their world still turns with the rhythm of the sea. In their language echo the voices of continents, words from Africa, Asia, and Brazil, all woven together through centuries of exchange. Portuguese, once the language of sailors and missionaries, now belongs to millions across the world, each voice a ripple in the great tide of history. By the waterfront, fishermen mend their nets as the sun climbs higher. Their hands, rough and sure, trace the same gestures as their ancestors, tying knots, mending threads, whispering to the sea. For all its modernity, Portugal remains a country bound to the ocean's pulse. Its people understand, perhaps better than any, that life is a balance between holding on and letting go, between the known shore and the endless horizon. And in that balance lies a quiet kind of peace. The empire is long gone. Its flags are dust, its fortresses softened by time. But its spirit, the courage to venture, to adapt, to dream beyond borders, still hums in the heart of Portugal. In the laughter of the market sellers, in the rhythm of the trams that climb the steep hills, in the melancholy of a guitar that weeps beneath a streetlight at night, the story continues. As the morning unfolds, light floods through the windows of the Geronimo's monastery, dancing across stone carvings of ropes, corals, and sea creatures. Inside, the tombs of Vasco da Gama and Camões lie side by side, the explorer and the poet, united by the sea and by destiny. One sailed the world, the other gave it meaning. Their silence now speaks louder than any cannon ever did. Outside, the city shines. The tide rises, the day begins, and the ocean glitters like a promise. Lisbon, the dreamer's city, watches it all with gentle pride. The empire may have vanished, but the wonder it awakened, the desire to explore, to connect, to understand, remains eternal. So when night comes again, and the sea glows silver beneath the moon, the old navigators will stir once more, and their ships of memory will set sail across your dreams, whispering softly. The world is vast, and the journey never ends. As the waves of the Atlantic stretch westward, they carry more than the reflection of the sun. They carry the echoes of the empire, whispers of a world once bound together by Portuguese sails and silver horizons. Though the ships are gone, their wake still ripples across continents, touching shores where the language, faith, and rhythm of Portugal took root and grew into something new, something enduring. Across the ocean lies Brazil, once the crown jewel of the Portuguese world. Here, the empire's legacy blooms not in marble or maps, but in the pulse of life itself, in the sound of samba, the taste of coffee, the warmth of the people. Portuguese words flow like music through the streets of Rio, Bahia, and Sao Paulo, bending and reshaping over centuries into something deeply Brazilian, yet forever connected to that faraway European coast. The Jesuits who once came with crosses and books found a land of immense beauty and deep spirit, and from that meeting was born a new culture, vast, hybrid, alive. The rhythm of Portuguese expansion did not just move west, it pulsed east, too, toward Africa, where the winds carried caravels to the shores of Angola and Mozambique. There, trade became empire, and empire became entanglement, of sorrow and resilience, of loss and rebirth. Enslaved men and women, taken from these lands, carried not only pain across the sea, but also songs, stories, and faith that would later echo in the churches and music of Brazil. Today, the Portuguese tongue still weaves through African markets and classrooms, a reminder of how history can bind and divide in the same breath. Sailing further east, beyond the Cape of Good Hope, the story reaches India, where Goa glows with the faded splendor of a colonial past. Beneath the palms and Baroque bell towers, Portuguese and Indian cultures fused into something uniquely luminous. Spices, faith, and art merged. Catholic churches rose beside Hindu temples, and in the kitchens of Goa, flavors from both worlds simmered together. Even now, the streets echo with fado sung in Konkani accents, and the breeze smells of both curry and salt. It is a living reminder that the empire was never just conquest. It was collision, conversation, and creation. Beyond India, the journey continues, to Malacca, Macau, Timor, and even Japan, where Portuguese traders once brought silk, silver, and a strange new weapon called the arquebus. In the east, They were both guests and strangers, teaching navigation and faith while learning the intricate languages of trade and diplomacy. Macau, perched on the edge of China, became the empire's last echo, a small yet glittering outpost of Europe clinging to the misty coast of Asia. There, east met west in winding streets where Chinese lanterns glowed beneath Jesuit crosses, and where the scent of incense mingled with ocean salt. Yet what lingers most from the Portuguese Empire is not its power or wealth, but its spirit, a quiet, enduring curiosity about the world and its people. From Angola's samba to Brazil's bossa nova, from Goa's architecture to Cape Verde's morna, every note and color still carries a trace of that first voyage, of hearts daring to cross unknown seas. Empires fall, but cultures transform. And in this transformation, Portugal left behind something far greater than borders, a network of memory, of shared words and melodies, of people connected by the tide. Today, more than 250 million voices speak Portuguese across the globe, each one a small spark from the great fire of exploration that once lit the oceans. So when the wind shifts and the sea begins to hum, perhaps it is not just the past calling. It is the continuation of that endless story, whispered from one shore to another. The empire may have vanished, but the ocean still remembers our name. And so, the waves keep moving, carrying the language of sailors, the prayers of dreamers, and the songs of all who once gazed at the horizon and believed the world could be known. There was a time when the sun seemed to rise and set over Portugal, when the world itself felt newly discovered with every tide. The year was the early 1500s, an age when the Atlantic wind carried whispers of gold, spices, and glory. Lisbon had become a city of wonder, its harbors crowded with ships from across the world, its air thick with the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and salt. To walk through its streets was to feel the pulse of a global empire, a living dream born from centuries of daring exploration. At dawn, the Tagus River shimmered beneath sails painted white with the red cross of the Order of Christ. From the decks of the returning caravels came cries of triumph, and sailors staggered onto the docks with sunburned faces, their hands clutching exotic goods, ivory from Africa, silk from China, pepper from India. The merchants shouted prices, the priests offered blessings, and the city swelled with pride. For a brief, golden moment, Lisbon was the beating heart of the world. In the royal palace overlooking the harbor, King Manuel I, known as the Fortunate, watched his empire expand with every sunrise. Under his rule, the fortunes of Portugal soared beyond imagination. From the coasts of Africa to the islands of the East Indies, the Portuguese flag fluttered over dozens of ports and fortresses. It wasn't merely an empire of conquest. It was an empire of connection, a web of sea routes that bound Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World together for the first time in human history. The Casa de India, the royal trading house, became the empire's brain. There, navigators charted new routes, merchants calculated profits, and maps, drawn in gold and ink, revealed how much of the world had already been touched by Portuguese hands. The world was no longer infinite. It was measurable, charted, named. And the men who returned from the sea were no longer sailors. They were legends. Names like Vasco da Gama, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, and Afonso de Albuquerque echoed across Europe. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to India opened the gates to the east, turning spices into treasure. Cabral, blown off course, stumbled upon a vast green land, Brazil, and unknowingly gave Portugal the richest colony it would ever possess. And Albuquerque, the empire's warrior governor, forged a network of fortresses from Goa to Malacca, his ambition carving a path through the Indian Ocean like a blade of fire. Yet behind the glory was danger. The seas were not gentle. They were wild and merciless. Many ships never returned, swallowed by storms or silence. Wives and mothers would walk the cliffs of Sagres or Lisbon's shore, gazing endlessly at the horizon for sails that never came. Still, the Portuguese kept sailing. For them, the ocean was not a barrier but a bridge, a living mystery that called to their restless hearts. This was the golden age of discovery, an era when a small kingdom at the edge of Europe dared to rewrite the map of the. And yet, even as Portugal's influence spread across oceans, something subtle began to change. The explorers who once dreamed of discovery began to dream of power. Trade became control, faith became conquest, and the open sea, once a symbol of freedom, became a stage for empire. Still, for a time, it felt as though nothing could end it. The sea was theirs. The wind belonged to them. And as the ships set sail from Lisbon under the soft glow of morning light, it was as if the entire world bowed to the courage of a people who had once been fishermen and dreamers, and had become masters of the horizon. The Portuguese sailors called themselves os Senhores do Mar, the lords of the sea. But when they stood upon the decks of their ships, staring into the boundless horizon, even they knew that the true master was the ocean itself. To cross it was to wager your life against the unknown. And yet, time and again, they sailed, drawn by a hunger no map could satisfy. Each voyage began with the same ritual, the blessing of the ship. Priests in white robes stood at the water's edge, their voices rising above the gulls, sprinkling holy water over the hull as sailors crossed themselves. The scent of incense mixed with salt and tar, and the air filled with murmured prayers, not all for glory, but for mercy. Families stood on the docks, clutching letters, weeping softly, knowing that months or years might pass before they heard from their loved ones again, if they ever did. Once the land disappeared behind them, the world became a whispering void of wind, wood, and water. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The men lived on salted meat, hard biscuits, and the hope that the horizon would not betray them. Below deck, darkness clung to every plank, and the creak of the ship sounded like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. Rats scurried in the barrels. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, brine, and smoke from oil lamps. At night, the stars became their only guide. The astrolabe and the cross staff were their companions, delicate instruments that turned the heavens into a map. The navigators, or pilotos, measured the angle of the sun by day and the position of the constellations by night. To them, the sea was a book written in starlight, and every degree of latitude a secret whispered by the cosmos. But the ocean was not always kind. The Cape of Storms, where Africa meets the Southern Sea, was a graveyard for ships. Winds howled like beasts, and waves rose taller than church towers. Men clung to the ropes, their hands bleeding, their prayers drowned by thunder. When storms passed, the silence that followed felt almost holy, the sound of the living giving thanks to the dead. Many sailors claimed they could still hear voices in the mist, the cries of those lost to the deep. Yet even amid fear, wonder never left them. Flying fish leapt from silver waves. The sea glowed at night with bioluminescent light, as if stars had fallen into the water. Dolphins raced the ships for days, and the men would lean over the rails, laughing like children. They saw skies that burned orange over the African coast, and islands so green they seemed to float on air. Each new sight, each new horizon, reminded them why they had come, to see what no one had seen, to touch what no one had dared to reach. The captains, too, carried their burdens. They were explorers, yes, but also soldiers and diplomats. Their maps were marked not just with coasts, but with promises of gold, faith, and empire. They had to lead men through hunger, fear, and the endless silence of the ocean. To fail was not just to die, but to vanish, erased from history, lost to the sea that gave them purpose. They were not saints, nor were they monsters. They were men between worlds, torn between the call of the divine and the lure of fortune. The Portuguese crown promised wealth, but the sea promised something greater, immortality. To chart a new coast was to etch your name into the bones of the earth. So they kept sailing, past maps, past reason, past fear. And in doing so, they became the ocean kings, rulers not of land or stone, but of movement, mystery, and memory. When they finally returned home, if they did, Their faces were leathered by salt and sun, their eyes distant, as if still seeing horizons beyond sight. They would kneel before the altars in Lisbon, lay down their banners, and whisper a single word that carried both pride and exhaustion. Fido, it is done. And yet, even as they slept on land, their dreams still smelled of salt and wind. For once a man had known the sea, he could never truly belong to the shore again. There was a time when Lisbon gleamed like a jewel set upon the sea, when the world's treasures seemed to flow endlessly into its harbors. The Portuguese called it a Idade das Especiarias e do Ouro, the age of spice and gold, and it was an age unlike any before or since. The city became a crossroads of the earth's riches, the point where the winds of empire met the pulse of human desire. At dawn, the scent of cinnamon and clove drifted through the narrow streets. Merchants from every corner of the world filled the marketplaces, their voices mingling in a dozen languages: Arabic, Malay, Swahili, Gujarati, and the lyrical tones of Portuguese itself. Ships groaned under the weight of their cargo: pepper from Calicut, nutmeg from the Bondo Islands, silk from China, ivory from Africa, and gold from Brazil. The quays of Lisbon were alive with color. Bolts of red and blue cloth fluttered in the breeze, sailors shouted orders, and nobles in embroidered doublets strolled along the docks, their boots gleaming in the morning light. Women sold sweet pastries and roasted chestnuts as children watched the ships with wide eyes, dreaming of the day they too might sail beyond the horizon. Inside the royal palace, the Casa de India overflowed with maps, ledgers, and crates marked with distant names. Clerks counted coins until their fingers ached, and every new ship that entered the port brought wealth that shimmered like the reflection of the sun upon the water. Portugal, once a small and humble kingdom, now sat at the center of a web that stretched across oceans. In Goa, Portuguese governors ruled from grand villas where Indian spices perfumed the air. In Mozambique, traders bartered for gold dust and slaves under the shade of palms. In Macau, Chinese porcelain gleamed beside crucifixes carved from ivory. And in Brazil, vast sugar plantations rose along the coast, worked by enslaved Africans whose suffering built the wealth of an empire that had once dreamed only of discovery. The age of discovery had become the age of dominion. Where once the caravels carried hope and curiosity, now they carried power and the shadow that always follows it. Yet still, for the people of Lisbon, this was a time of wonder. The churches grew taller, their altars gilded in gold from the New World. The monasteries hummed with the voices of scholars and monks copying manuscripts brought from distant lands. And at night, the sound of music, fado and folk songs, carried on the sea breeze, filled the taverns where sailors told stories that blurred truth and legend. They spoke of seas that glowed green with fire, of islands ruled by birds, of giants in the New World, and of storms that whispered men's names before swallowing their ships whole. But with every coin of gold that entered Lisbon, a price was paid somewhere else. The riches of the East and the New World came at a terrible cost, of lives lost, of cultures subdued, of lands claimed in the name of faith and fortune. And though the empire seemed eternal, its foundations were already beginning to crack. The kings who followed Manuel, I saw not the wonder of the world, but the weight of its riches. Their palaces grew larger, their feasts more extravagant, and their eyes turned away from the sea that had made them great. The sailors, once heroes, became laborers in service of crowns and contracts. And the ocean, once a path of freedom, began to feel like a cage of endless expectation. Yet for now, in that brief, brilliant century, Portugal shone brighter than any nation on earth. Its flag flew across continents, its language echoed from African shores to Brazilian jungles, and its ships ruled the waters of two great oceans. Lisbon was the heart of the world, beating with gold and salt and prayer. And as the sun set over the Tagus River, painting the sails crimson and gold, it seemed, for just a moment, that the empire could last forever. For every empire that glitters beneath the sun, there comes a moment when the light begins to dim. For Portugal, The shadows did not fall all at once. They crept slowly, quietly, beneath the white sails that had once carried its dreams across the world. The ocean, once their ally, began to whisper of debts unpaid, of promises broken, and of souls lost in pursuit of gold and glory. At first, no one noticed. The markets of Lisbon still overflowed with riches. The priests still blessed the voyages. The maps still stretched wider every year. But behind the marble and gold, something was changing. The heart of the empire, the courage that had driven it to the edge of the world, was beginning to decay. The kings grew complacent, their thrones cushioned by the wealth of continents they had never seen. Where Prince Henry the Navigator had once dreamed of knowledge, they now dreamed of crowns heavier with jewels. The nobles feasted while the sailors starved. The merchants cheated their partners and bribed officials, and the vast bureaucracy of empire began to rot from within. The church, too, weighed heavily on the sails of the empire. What had begun as a mission of faith, to spread Christianity across the seas, became entangled in politics and greed. Missionaries argued with governors, bishops quarreled over trade rights, and beneath the cross, the empire's true motives shimmered like a mirage. Souls were baptized, yes, but often at the end of a sword. And far from Lisbon, in the distant corners of empire, the conquered began to stir. In Goa, Indian rulers resented the arrogance of their Portuguese overlords. In Africa, tribes fought back against coastal forts that stole their people. Even in Brazil, where vast plantations stretched beneath the tropical sun, whispers of rebellion drifted through the fields. But the greatest enemy came not from without, but from within, from the sea itself. Storms struck harder. Ships vanished without a trace. The ocean that had once opened its arms now seemed to close them. Sailors spoke of omens, red skies that glowed before disaster, strange lights beneath the waves, voices calling their names in the fog. Superstition crept into their hearts where once there had been only courage. Meanwhile, new powers were rising on the horizon. Spain, England, and the Netherlands, nations once humbled by Portuguese mastery, now built their own fleets. They studied Portugal's maps, copied its routes, and turned its secrets against it. The seas were no longer Portugal's alone. The world had grown larger, and with it came competition, envy, and war. Lisbon's harbor, once filled with the proud white sails of discovery, now saw ships return burned, broken, or empty. The merchants muttered that the gold had begun to run dry, and the crown demanded more from colonies already bleeding. Taxes rose, hunger spread, and the once bright empire began to crumble at its edges. Yet, even amid decline, there remained a strange beauty, a tragic grandeur in the way Portugal clung to its legacy. The sailors still set out to sea, though fewer returned. The bells of Lisbon still rang for departing ships, their echoes fading into the horizon. And in the quiet corners of the empire, old explorers told stories of the days when Portugal had ruled the oceans, when men had believed that courage alone could shape the world. The shadows beneath the sails grew longer, but still they sailed, out of pride, out of hope, or perhaps simply because the sea had become a part of their soul. For empires do not die in a single night. They fade, like sunlight sinking beneath the waves, slowly, beautifully, and with the memory of their brilliance still glowing beneath the surface. It began not with an enemy's sword, but with the slow unraveling of fate itself. The Portuguese Empire, which had once stretched across oceans like a web of light, now trembled beneath the weight of its own glory. The sea that had crowned its kings and carried its wealth began to roar in defiance, and the fires that had once guided its ships now burned through its heart. The year was 1580, and the unthinkable had happened. Portugal, proud and ancient, lost its king. King Sebastian, young and fervent with dreams of crusade, had vanished in the sands of Morocco, leaving behind no heir and a kingdom adrift. His death, or disappearance, as some whispered, became the wound from which the empire would bleed. Lisbon mourned not only a monarch, but an era. In the chaos that followed, Spain claimed the Portuguese crown. The two Iberian powers, once rivals, now shared one king. Philip II of Spain. To the world, it seemed a union of strength, but to the Portuguese, it felt like a chain. The red and green banners that had once flown freely above the seas now fluttered beside the gold and crimson of Castile. The empire that had discovered half the world was now ruled from Madrid. The seas turned hostile. The Dutch and English, hungry for trade and vengeance, struck at Portuguese forts and ships wherever they could. They raided Goa, seized Malacca, and took hold of the spice islands that had once filled Lisbon's coffers. The Indian Ocean, once a Portuguese lake, now churned with foreign sails. But the greatest blow came not from battle, but from the earth itself. On All Saints' Day, 1755, as the faithful filled Lisbon's churches, the ground began to tremble. The sky darkened. Bells fell from towers. The sea, drawn back as if inhaling, returned as a wall of water. The Lisbon earthquake, one of the deadliest in history, shattered the city and the empire's spirit. Fire consumed what the waves spared. The screams of the living mingled with the prayers of the dying. When dawn broke, the city that had once ruled the oceans lay in ruins, its palaces reduced to ash, its harbor filled with wreckage. For those who survived, it felt as if God himself had turned his face away. The catastrophe became more than a disaster. It was an omen. Philosophers across Europe spoke of it as a divine reckoning, a moment when even the most powerful realized how fragile human ambition truly was. In the decades that followed, Portugal rebuilt, but it was never the same. The world it had once connected had outgrown it. The colonies that once bent to Lisbon's will now whispered of independence. Brazil, the empire's jewel, had grown too vast, too proud, too rich to remain a colony forever. And when the time came, it slipped from Portugal's grasp as quietly as a ship leaving harbor at night. The empire burned slowly, not in one great blaze, but in countless smaller fires. One by one, its outposts faded: Malacca, Goa, Mozambique, Macau. The red cross of Portugal that had once marked the edges of the known world was replaced by new flags, new powers, new empires. And yet, even as the flames consumed the dream, something remained, an ember that refused to die. The Portuguese people, battered but unbroken, still looked to the sea with the same restless eyes as their ancestors. For though their empire had fallen, the ocean, their first and greatest love, could never truly be taken from them. The sea had made them. The sea had tested them. And in the end, the sea would remember them. When night fell over Lisbon, the waves lapped softly at the shore, whispering through the ruins of the city. Somewhere in the dark, a sailor's song drifted on the wind, low, mournful, but still full of hope. "We have lost the world," it said, "but the horizon still belongs to us." When the fires of empire had cooled and the maps of the world no longer bore the red cross of Portugal, something unexpected began to stir amid the ruins: memory. It whispered through the cracked stones of Lisbon, in the songs of fishermen along the Tagus River, and in the faded journals of sailors who had once charted the edge of the world. Portugal, small and battered, stood before the mirror of history and saw not defeat, but endurance. The 18th and 19th centuries became an age of reflection, of poets and dreamers who sought to give meaning to what had been lost. They spoke of saudade, a word that defied translation, part sorrow, part longing, part love for something that could never return. It became the soul of Portugal, the echo of its vanished empire turned into art. In taverns by the sea, fado singers poured that emotion into haunting melodies, voices trembling like candle flames in the dark. Each note carried the ache of centuries, of ships that never returned, of lovers left on the docks, of glory that had faded like the tide. The Portuguese no longer ruled the seas, but they ruled something far deeper: the art of remembering. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the last remnants of their empire flickered like distant lanterns. Goa, Macau, Angola, and Mozambique remained under the Portuguese crown, even as the winds of revolution and independence began to rise around them. The world had entered a new age of nations, and Portugal, though diminished, clung to the ghost of its empire like a relic of another time. The 19th century was a struggle not of conquest, but of identity. Industrial Europe surged forward, while Portugal, poor and isolated, looked backward, not out of arrogance, but nostalgia. The past had become both burden and comfort. Monarchs rose and fell, revolutions flared and faded. And yet through it all, the spirit of discovery, once born in caravels and compasses, lived on in something quieter, the human heart's endless yearning for the horizon. Writers like Luis de Camões, whose Lusíads had celebrated the age of exploration, became prophets of remembrance. Scholars and sailors alike would gather under oil lamps and read his verses aloud, the rhythm of his words rising like waves. They spoke of courage and tragedy, of the sea's eternal call, of how a nation so small could dream so impossibly big. In time, even as its colonies declared independence, Portugal learned to see the empire not as a loss, but as a story, a shared inheritance that connected continents and cultures through language, food, and faith. From Brazil's samba to Goa's churches, from Mozambique's rhythms to Macau's old fort walls, the fingerprints of Portugal remained like faint constellations scattered across the world. Lisbon rebuilt herself from the ashes. New buildings rose on the old stones, elegant and bright. The streets filled once more with laughter and light. And in the quiet evenings, as the sun dipped beneath the Atlantic, the people still turned their eyes to the sea, not to conquer it again, but to remember. The empire was gone. The gold had faded. The maps had changed. But the stories, those survived. And in the end, perhaps that was Portugal's truest victory. For empires fall, but memories do not. They echo through time, in song, in language, in the salt air of the coast, whispering to all who will listen that greatness is not in conquest, but in the courage to dream. As the night settles over the Atlantic, and the waves sigh against the rocks below Belém Tower, the voice of the past softens to a lullaby. The world sleeps, but the sea remembers, and in that endless rhythm, the story of Portugal goes on, forever entwined with the tides. In the stillness that followed centuries of conquest, Portugal began to rediscover itself, not as an empire of ships and cannons, but as a nation of poets, dreamers, and storytellers. The ports that once launched fleets to unknown worlds now opened to travelers, artists, and philosophers seeking to understand what it meant to be Portuguese in a world that had moved on. Lisbon, once the capital of a global empire, transformed into a city of reflection. The scent of coffee and sea salt drifted through narrow alleys of faded pastel houses. Beneath wrought iron balconies hung the ghosts of explorers and kings, now replaced by painters sketching the rooftops and writers murmuring verses in dim cafes. The empire's echoes became the city's heartbeat, softer, wiser, but still unmistakably proud. For centuries, Portugal had defined itself by the sea, and now, in its twilight, the ocean became its companion once more, not as a frontier to conquer, but as a mirror. Along the cliffs of Sagres, where Prince Henry once watched his caravels vanish into the unknown, the waves whispered of journeys that would never end. And though the maps no longer bore Portuguese banners, every coastline from Africa to Asia still spoke its language, a quiet reminder of how far one small nation had reached. The 20th century brought change like a storm wind. Revolutions rattled the old order. Colonies rose to claim their freedom. The old empire dissolved, piece by piece, into the modern age. And yet, even as Portugal's dominions faded into history, something new began to take root, a sense of unity, of shared humanity born from centuries of connection. The empire of trade and power was gone, but the empire of culture, of words, songs, and hearts, endured. In Brazil, the language flourished, rich and alive. In Goa, church bells still rang beneath tropical suns. In Mozambique, Portuguese melodies mingled with African drums, creating rhythms that spoke of pain and beauty in equal measure. Across oceans and generations, the bond held. It was no longer about rule, it was about remembrance. And within Portugal itself, a quiet pride grew, not the pride of conquest, but of survival. The people learned to celebrate their smallness, their humility, their place at the western edge of Europe, looking forever toward the endless blue. They found greatness not in empire, but in endurance, in the strength to begin again after the world had forgotten them. In literature and film, in the mournful beauty of Amalia Rodrigues Fadu, in the writings of Fernando Pessoa, Portugal began to speak once more, softly, but with the weight of centuries behind each word. Pessoa wrote of the sea as a mirror of the soul, of longing as the true inheritance of a seafaring people. His words became a map for a new kind of exploration, one that led inward. By the late 20th century, Portugal's story had turned full circle. No longer an empire, it was once again what it had been in the beginning, a nation at the edge of the world, dreaming toward the horizon. The caravels were gone, but the spirit that had built them remained, carried in the hearts of those who still stood at the docks, watching the sun fall into the sea. And so, the age of rediscovery was not about new lands, but about rediscovering what had always been true, that Portugal's real power lay not in gold or colonies, but in its ability to dream beyond its size, to believe, even when the world did not, that the smallest nations could leave the deepest marks. As the waves roll endlessly beneath the stars, and the lamps of Lisbon cast their golden light across the river, you can almost feel the heartbeat of a people who never truly stopped exploring, only changed the direction of their voyage. The empire sleeps, the nation breathes, the sea remembers, and Portugal dreams still. Even as the sails of empire had long vanished from the horizon, their echoes still crossed the oceans. They lingered in the soft cadences of Portuguese spoken under tropical suns, in the taste of spices that once filled the holds of caravels, in the melodies that wove Europe and Africa and the Americas into one continuous song. The world had changed beyond recognition, yet the imprint of Portugal's voyages remained, subtle but indelible, like the lines of a map etched into the memory of the sea itself. In Brazil, the largest of Portugal's legacies, that echo became a symphony. What had begun as a distant colony grew into a vast, pulsing nation, vibrant, creative, and uncontainable. The language of Lisbon bloomed there into something new, softer, more musical, alive with rhythm. The churches that rose in Bahia, the plantations that scarred the earth, the samba that later filled the air with joy, all of them carried traces of a story that began with ships leaving the Tagus 5 centuries earlier. Portugal had planted seeds it could never have imagined, and though the empire crumbled, those seeds grew into forests of culture and identity that would outlast all crowns. Across the seas in Goa, the legacy took a different shape, a blend of East and West, of Hindu temples and whitewashed cathedrals standing side by side beneath the sun. The people prayed in Konkani and Portuguese, their songs a mingling of two worlds. In Macau, lanterns glowed beside European facades, and merchants spoke a language woven from Cantonese and the speech of explorers. Even in Angola and Mozambique, where colonization brought centuries of pain, the shared tongue became a bridge after the chains of empire were broken, a language that once divided, now connecting. Everywhere the Portuguese had gone, they had left something behind, not just stone forts or faded flags, but fragments of feeling, fragments of song. The ocean itself seemed to hum with it. Sailors off the coast of Africa would sometimes say that if you listened closely enough to the wind at night, you could still hear the whispers of the caravels, the creak of their wooden hulls, the murmured prayers to saints before the storms. And yet, these echoes were not ghosts of conquest alone. They were reminders of humanity's oldest impulse, to reach beyond the known. Portugal's sailors had followed that impulse to the ends of the earth, and in doing so, they had bound the world together in ways they never intended. The exchange of goods became the exchange of cultures, of ideas, of lives. The empire's greatest mistake, its hunger for domination, also became its accidental gift, the weaving of a global tapestry. In the modern age, that tapestry remains visible in small, beautiful ways. A Portuguese word on a street sign in Brazil, a melody in Goa that carries both Indian and Iberian notes, a recipe in Mozambique rich with chili and olive oil. Each of these is an echo, not of empire's cruelty, but of humanity's capacity to adapt, to merge, to create new beauty from collision. Lisbon's sailors once sailed to the edge of the world. Now the edge of the world comes back to Lisbon. Immigrants from Africa, Brazil, and Asia fill the markets with color and music, their voices rising together in a chorus that feels timeless. The empire that once reached outward has come home again, transformed, healed, alive. As the night deepens over the Atlantic and the lights of Belém shimmer like distant stars, you can almost sense the unity of it all. From every direction, the echoes of Portuguese journeys converge, not as reminders of domination, but of connection. The sea has carried everything back, and in that returning, Portugal finds its truest reflection, not an empire of borders, but an empire of belonging. The waves move softly now. The world that once trembled beneath Portuguese sails lies calm beneath the moon. The sea that had witnessed ambition and conquest, love and loss, now cradles silence, a silence that feels ancient, sacred, and endless. The caravels are gone, their wooden bones lost to time, but the spirit that guided them, that longing to see what lies beyond the horizon, still drifts through every tide. Lisbon, once the beating heart of a global empire, sleeps by the water's edge. Its streets glimmer beneath the soft golden lamps, their cobblestones remembering the footsteps of kings, sailors, and poets. In the distance, the Tower of Belém stands like a sentinel of memory, watching the same river that once carried ships into destiny. The breeze off the Tagus tastes faintly of salt and time. The empire's glory is gone, yet something deeper remains, a peace born of knowing one's place in history. Portugal no longer seeks to rule the seas, it listens to them. The lessons carved into its centuries are not of power, but of perspective, that greatness is fleeting, but purpose is eternal. Each generation must sail its own course, and when the winds of ambition fade, what remains are the stories that outlive empires, crossing oceans not by ships, but by hearts. Somewhere, far beyond the coastline, the ghosts of the explorers still drift, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Henry the Navigator, not as conquerors, but as dreamers, chasing the horizon that never ends. The stars above them burn as they always have, indifferent and infinite. Beneath those same stars, a listener, you, lies beneath the gentle rhythm of the night, carried by the echoes of their journeys. The ocean hums its lullaby, a song older than any nation. This was never just the story of Portugal. It was the story of humanity's need to reach beyond itself, to map the unknown, to connect the distant, to find meaning in the endless. From golden shores to distant colonies, from triumph to ruin, the arc of the Portuguese Empire bends not toward loss, but toward understanding. It teaches that discovery does not end at the world's edge, but continues inward, into the soul. And so, as the waves whisper against the harbor walls and the stars shimmer like scattered coins upon the sea, the final voyage begins, not into new lands, but into memory, into rest, into peace. The caravels of thought drift slowly toward the horizon, their sails catching the wind of time. The sea holds them gently. The past fades like the tide. And Portugal, small, eternal, luminous, dreams on. You can rest now. The journey is complete. The empire sleeps beneath the waves, but the story lives forever. Long after the cannons went silent and the banners faded into dust, the sea remained, eternal, patient, and vast. It had always been the true ruler of Portugal, the one force no empire could command. The people learned to listen again, as their ancestors once did, to the rhythms of the waves. The sea was not an enemy, nor a prize. It was a teacher. In its endless movement, they began to see their own reflection, resilient, restless, and forever yearning. The generations born after the empire no longer dreamed of gold or conquest. They dreamed of meaning. They stood upon the cliffs of the Algarve and felt the wind against their faces, knowing that the same air had touched the sails of explorers centuries ago. They watched fishing boats slide across the morning mist and thought of their ancestors who had once vanished into that same horizon, never to return. The sea had taken much, lives, hopes, innocence, yet it had given something greater in return, understanding. In the quiet villages that dotted the coastline, old fishermen told stories by lantern light. They spoke of shipwrecks and storms, of whales that followed caravels, of saints who guided lost sailors home. Children listened with wide eyes, their imaginations sailing across centuries. The tales were not just memories, they were inheritance, a way of keeping the past alive without letting it rule the present. The spirit of exploration, once bound to ships, now turned inward, into art, into song, into soul. In small Lisbon apartments, musicians strummed guitars and sang fado, those low, aching songs that seemed to rise from the ocean itself. Every note was a voyage, every word a compass pointing towards something lost but never forgotten. The voices trembled not with grief, but with love, a love for what had been and what would always remain. And through this transformation, Portugal became something rare, a nation at peace with its past. Where others saw failure in the fall of empires, Portugal saw poetry. It had touched every corner of the earth, and now it had returned home, carrying with it the beauty and sorrow of the world. Its power was no longer in its ships, but in its ability to feel deeply, to turn memory into music, longing into art, history into humanity. Travelers from across the globe came to Lisbon and felt something they could not name. They walked its sloping streets, heard church bells echo through the Alfama, watched sunlight scatter across the river, and felt time slow. There was melancholy there, yes, but also serenity. It was as if the entire city was breathing in rhythm with the tides, whispering, "All things pass, but beauty endures." At the edge of the continent, Portugal remained suspended between the sea and the sky, the last dream of Europe before the vast unknown. The caravels are gone, but the longing that built them still hums in the wind, timeless and unbroken. And if you stand there on a quiet night and close your eyes, you can still hear it. The ocean, the memory, the soul of a people who once reached the ends of the earth and found, at last, themselves. The legacy of Portugal does not roar like thunder. It glows like candlelight, steady, golden, and patient. Long after the caravels disappeared beyond the horizon, their spirit lingered in the quiet radiance of what they left behind. The Portuguese did not simply build an empire of stone and sails. They built an empire of light, a soft illumination that reached across oceans into hearts and histories. Walk through the streets of Lisbon, and you feel that light still. It shimmers on the pale tiles of the azulejos, those blue and white mosaics that tell stories without words. They line churches, palaces, and humble homes alike, their patterns reflecting both the Moorish precision and the Christian faith that shaped the nation. Each tile is a memory, a fragment of identity, a glimmer of the empire's far-reaching hands. In Porto, the same light falls on the Douro River, turning the water into molten silver as wine boats drift lazily beneath arched bridges. The scent of grapes and salt fills the air, the old world meeting the new. Here, too, the empire lives on, not in domination, but in the artistry of survival, in the way a small people turned hardship into beauty, loss into flavor, and nostalgia into strength. Across the world, Portugal's glow can still be seen in the architecture of Goa's whitewashed basilicas, in the winding streets of Macau's old quarter, and in the melodies that drift through Brazilian nights, where samba and fado intertwine like lovers reunited after centuries apart. Even in Africa, the rhythm of Portuguese drums echoes faintly through the pulse of modern music, carrying with it the deep, timeless beat of resilience. This legacy is not one of power, it is one of presence. It is felt in the warmth of a meal, in the hush of a chapel, in the sound of the sea through an open window. It is in the language that now binds continents, the Lusophone world, stretching from Lisbon to Luanda, from Rio to Maputo, from Timor to Cape Verde. Millions of people speak with the same words, but with different hearts, and together they form something that no empire could have planned, a living network of cultures connected by memory rather than rule. Portugal, once a small corner of Europe, has become a quiet thread woven through the fabric of humanity. It is not loud or boastful, but everywhere if you know how to look. In the curve of a balcony, the flavor of a dish, the rhythm of a song, the soul of that nation lingers, wistful, enduring, kind. The world may remember the empire for its exploration, but those who truly listen hear something gentler beneath the surface, a light that never went out. It shines through centuries of shadow, through the silence of forgotten harbors, through the lull of waves beneath Belém Tower. That light is not just Portugal's gift to the world, it is its message. That beauty can rise from impermanence, that loss can turn to art, that even the smallest flame can outlast the storm. And when night falls over Lisbon and the sea glows under a pale moon, that same ancient light flickers once more, across oceans, across time, reminding us that discovery was never just about the world outside, but the world within. Even centuries after the last galleon vanished into the mist, the spirit that drove Portugal's explorers still drifts across the waves. It lingers in the air of Lisbon's waterfront, where the salt wind whispers through the masts of anchored boats, carrying a memory older than any map. The world has changed, the seas are charted, the continents connected, yet the desire to journey beyond what is known has never faded. It has only transformed, flowing into new vessels, the minds of artists, travelers, and dreamers who see the horizon not as a boundary, but as a beginning. In every age, there are those who feel the same pull that once stirred the hearts of men like Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan, a yearning not for gold or glory, but for meaning. These are the dreamers who stare out at the Atlantic and feel the pulse of something vast, something waiting. They are the modern navigators, chasing discovery through knowledge, through music, through art. They no longer carry compasses and sextants, but cameras, notebooks, and open souls. Their maps are drawn in emotion rather than ink. Portugal itself has become a harbor for such spirits, a land both ancient and young, where cobblestone streets meet digital screens and old songs meet new rhythms. In cafes lit by amber lamps, poets write verses that echo the melancholy of Fado, while entrepreneurs build worlds of light and code that reach across the planet. The sea is still there, still calling, but now it calls through imagination. The voyage continues, just in another form. The dreamers of today do not fear the unknown. They embrace it, as the navigators once did. They know that discovery lies not in what we find, but in how we look. When a traveler stands on the cliffs of Sagres, staring into the endless Atlantic, they stand in the same wind that once filled the sails of caravels. The same courage hums beneath their skin, the same longing to see what lies beyond the visible world. And this is the true inheritance of the Portuguese Empire. Not the colonies, not the riches, not the vanished power, but the hunger for wonder, the endless pursuit of what might be. It is the reason a fisherman hums a tune as the sun rises over Nazar. It is why a writer feels compelled to capture the fleeting scent of ocean rain. It is why a sailor, alone in the dark, still whispers a prayer to the sea. That ancient longing to reach beyond, Saudade, is Portugal's most enduring compass. It guides not ships, but hearts. It reminds us that every journey is both outward and inward, that to discover the world is to discover ourselves. The Portuguese were never just explorers of geography, they were explorers of the soul. And so, as night deepens and the stars stretch their silver paths across the Atlantic sky, you can almost hear them, the whispers of those dreamers, old and new, blending together in the hush of the waves. Their stories are not finished. The sea is never done telling them, because somewhere, always, there will be another horizon and another heart willing to follow it.
The world that Portugal once charted began, in time, to outgrow its maps.
The parchment that once glowed with the golden outlines of faraway lands grew brittle, its colors fading like the twilight after a long voyage. The names of colonies and trading ports that once made the hearts of kings burn with pride slowly vanished from the ledgers of empire. But the story did not end with conquest or collapse. It ended quietly, like the tide withdrawing from a shore it had loved too long. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the oceans that had carried Portugal's ships now carried new empires: British, French, Dutch, their sails brighter, their cannons heavier, their ambitions sharper. Lisbon, once the center of the world's imagination, stood as a memory of a past too grand to repeat. The once mighty caravella ships rested in the shipyards, their wood weathered by time, their sails folded forever. And yet, the Portuguese spirit did not vanish with them. It lingered in the harbors, in the songs of sailors, in the gentle stoicism of the people who still watched the sea as if waiting for something to return. Empires often fall with noise: revolutions, uprisings, wars. Portugal's, however, dissolved like mist. Its colonies sought freedom, its rulers sought meaning, and its people, those who once stood at the edge of the known world, began to turn inward to the quiet work of remembering. The loss of empire did not feel like defeat. It felt like waking from a long, magnificent dream. A dream filled with storms, stars, and endless waves. The maps, once drawn with such precision and pride, became artifacts. Their lines blurred, their borders meaningless. But in those fading lines, a new beauty emerged, a reminder that no map can hold forever what was born of imagination. The Portuguese Empire had been built not merely on conquest, but on curiosity, on longing, on that deep ache to touch the horizon. And even as its borders disappeared, that longing endured. The poets began to write of what had been lost, not with bitterness, but with tenderness. They spoke of saudade, that untranslatable ache for something gone, yet never forgotten. It was more than nostalgia, it was love stretched across centuries. You could feel it in the streets of Lisbon, in the slow tolling of church bells, in the melancholy of fado music drifting from a dimly lit tavern. Portugal's empire had faded, but its soul had deepened. And across the seas, in the places once touched by its sails, in Brazil, Mozambique, Goa, Macau, the legacy lived on in language, in architecture, in rhythm. A word here, a melody there, a spice in a stew, fragments of an empire reborn as culture. The empire had scattered its seeds across the world, and now, in its fading, those seeds began to bloom in new soil. The maps may have faded, but the ocean remained, eternal, restless, whispering of old voyages and new beginnings. The Portuguese understood something most empires never did, that to lose power is not to lose meaning. The sea teaches that every wave that breaks must fall, yet the tide always returns. And so, though the maps dimmed and the ships vanished into the past, the story of Portugal continued, not as an empire, but as a memory carried by the world itself. A quiet persistence, like the rhythm of waves against stone, echoing through time. Long after the last Portuguese flag was lowered in distant lands, the oceans still whispered their story. The same waves that once carried explorers and merchants now carried their echoes, soft, steady, eternal. Across the coasts of Africa, the shores of Brazil, and the harbors of Asia, the rhythm of the Portuguese tongue lingered like the aftertaste of salt and wine. It was no longer the language of empire, but of memory, of lullabies sung by fishermen, of prayers murmured at dawn, of poems whispered to the sea. In Brazil, the language bloomed into something vast and living. Portuguese mixed with African drums, with the voices of indigenous peoples, with the endless green of the Amazon. It became more musical, more alive, no longer the speech of sailors, but of dreamers and storytellers. In the hills of Goa, church bells rang beside temples, their echoes blending faiths that had once clashed under colonial rule. In Mozambique and Angola, the rhythm of Lisbon's fado found a heartbeat in the cadence of local songs. The empire had vanished, but its soul had not. It had transformed, no longer a single voice commanding the seas, but a chorus of countless ones answering back. And that is perhaps the most profound thing about the Portuguese legacy.
It did not vanish with conquest, nor with time. It adapted, flowed, merged, like water finding new paths through stone. The sailors of the 15th century had once looked outward, chasing the edges of the world. But now, centuries later, their descendants looked inward, toward the stories that tied them to that boundless sea. The caravellas may have decayed, their sails long torn by time, but in the minds of the people, they still sailed, forever cutting through blue horizons under skies that never forgot their names. In Lisbon, you can still stand at the edge of the Belém Tower, where explorers once departed into the unknown. The wind carries a scent of salt and old wood, and for a moment, you can almost hear them, the voices of sailors calling out to one another, laughter echoing against the stone, prayers whispered into the vast night before the journey began. The ocean before them was not just water, it was destiny. And so, the echoes continued, not in battle or empire, but in song, in art, in spirit. The world that Portugal once reached now reached back, reshaping the nation that had first set it in motion. The empire was gone, but in its place stood something deeper, connection. The Portuguese had once sought to bind the world through trade. Now, centuries later, the world was bound by memory, by the shared pulse of history that beats beneath every wave. The sea that had once been Portugal's greatest ally and harshest judge now served as its keeper. Every ripple was a word, every tide a verse, and together they told the same story, of courage, of curiosity, of loss and longing. And if you listen closely, even today, standing on a quiet coast beneath a pale moon, you might hear it, the soft, eternal hum of a people who once sailed farther than anyone dared, who dreamed bigger than the world itself, and who, even in their fading, became infinite.
As the 20th century dawned, Portugal stood at a strange and solemn crossroad, a small country burdened by the vast shadow of its past. The empire that had once stretched across oceans had receded, piece by piece, like a tide drawing back into the sea. But what remained was not silence. It was reflection, the moment when a nation, after centuries of outward conquest, finally turned inward to find its heart again. The ports that once brimmed with ships now stood quiet. In the alleys of Lisbon, the scent of coffee mingled with the faint salt of the Atlantic, and old men sat by the harbor, watching the sea as though waiting for something to return. And perhaps, in a way, they were, waiting not for explorers or cargo, but for meaning, for understanding, for a new kind of discovery that would not demand sails or stars, but courage of another kind, the courage to face oneself. This was the age of return, not of empire, but of identity. Portugal began to see itself not as a conqueror, but as a storyteller. Its music, especially fado, that haunting, soulful lament, became the language of a people coming to terms with loss. The songs carried echoes of sailors long gone, of mothers who had waited by the sea, of lovers whose letters were swallowed by the waves. Fado was not just music, it was memory woven into melody. It was the empire distilled into emotion, sorrow, pride, and something deeper still, saudade, that untranslatable ache of longing that defines the Portuguese soul. In Lisbon's Alfama district, voices rose from narrow balconies at dusk, carrying this old sorrow to the stars. Lanterns flickered like tiny beacons, and every note seemed to drift back through centuries, to the explorers, to the poets, to the dreamers who had once stood at the edge of the world. The empire had ended, but its echoes had become art.
And as the colonies gained independence, from Goa to Mozambique, from Angola to Macau, Portugal's heart broke and healed in equal measure. For in losing its empire, it rediscovered its humanity. No longer a power reaching outward, it became a bridge reaching across, connecting histories, languages, and memories that could never truly be divided by time or distance. The sailor's courage was reborn in quieter forms. It was in the architects rebuilding Lisbon after the great earthquake scars, in the painters who found beauty in the chipped tiles of forgotten homes, in the poets who turned sorrow into song. Portugal's greatness no longer lay in its reach, but in its depth, in the way it could feel, remember, and dream. The sea, once a path to conquest, became a mirror. In its shifting blue, Portugal saw both what it had been and what it could be, a nation not of empire, but of emotion, not of command, but of connection. The people learned to navigate new waters, the tides of memory, identity, and hope. And so, in the soft twilight of the empire's afterglow, a new Portugal began to emerge, one that no longer measured itself by the miles it had conquered, but by the songs it still sang to the sea. There is a sea inside every Portuguese heart. It is not made of water, but of silence, a quiet, shimmering expanse of memory and longing. It moves softly beneath every story, every song, every glance toward the horizon. For the Portuguese, the ocean was never merely geography. It was emotion, faith, and fate combined. The waves were teachers, the winds were voices, and the endless blue was a reminder that the world and the soul are both far larger than they appear. When the caravels once left the shores of Lisbon, they were not only exploring the world, they were carrying a part of the Portuguese spirit across it. And when those ships were gone, when their sails disappeared beyond the curve of the earth, that spirit did not vanish. It became something internal, something timeless. The ocean settled into the people themselves. They became wanderers in thought, explorers in feeling, always searching, never still. Generations later, that same restlessness still hums beneath the cobblestones of Porto, in the salt-stained walls of coastal towns like Aveiro and Setúbal. Fishermen still rise before dawn, their faces carved by wind and years, whispering prayers to the Virgin as they push their boats into the gray light. Children still run barefoot along the sand, their laughter mingling with the cries of gulls, their eyes fixed on the horizon as if they already know they are meant to go, to follow the sea, to find what lies beyond. Even those who never leave Portugal carry the sea within them. It is in the slow rhythm of speech, in the patience of the people, in the melancholy sweetness that lingers even in joy. It is in the way time moves, not hurried, but with the steady flow of tides. And when the sun sets over the Tagus River, painting the water gold, it feels as though the past and present breathe together, the empire's ghost resting gently on the waves. The sea has become the country's conscience, reminding it of the beauty of discovery and the cost of ambition. For every triumph carried home on a ship's deck, there were tears left behind on the shore. The Portuguese learned to live with this duality, pride and regret, distance and belonging, woven into the same song. This balance is what gave birth to saudade, that word with no translation because it is not meant to be explained. It is meant to be felt. And so, when a fado singer closes her eyes and lets her voice rise, trembling, aching, beautiful, she is not merely performing. She is speaking the language of the sea within her. Her song becomes a tide, carrying centuries of love and loss. It washes over listeners like a lullaby and a storm all at once. The ocean that once separated Portugal from the world now connects it. It runs through its veins like history made liquid. The Portuguese do not merely stand beside the sea. They belong to it, as it belongs to them. Every wave that breaks on the shore seems to whisper the same truth, that to live is to journey, to lose, to long, and to begin again. The empire ended, the maps faded, but the sea remained, unchanged, eternal, waiting. It is the oldest friend and the final witness. And in its rhythm, Portugal still finds itself, again and again, like a heart remembering how to beat. They say that somewhere, beyond the horizon, a lone sailor still drifts across the sea, the last of his kind. His ship is old, its wood worn smooth by centuries of wind and salt, but it still holds together, creaking softly as it glides through the silver waves. The stars above are his only companions, and their reflections shimmer on the water like candles on glass. No one knows his name, nor when he first set sail. Some say he left the shores of Portugal long ago, chasing a dream that no map could hold. Others whisper that he was never a man at all, but the spirit of the nation itself, forever wandering between past and present, between longing and peace. By day, the sailor drifts through mist so thick it seems to breathe. He sees no land, only the pale light of dawn breaking through the fog, turning the sea into liquid gold. Sometimes he hums a tune, soft, slow, familiar, a melody that sounds like fado carried on the wind. It's the same song the widows once sang on Lisbon's hills, waiting for ships that never returned. Each note ripples across the water, and the ocean answers with a sigh. He has no compass now, no need for one. The sea itself guides him, just as it guided his ancestors. It knows his thoughts before he speaks them, his fears before he feels them. It carries him not to places, but through time, through memories of bustling ports, of kings and captains, of young men with hope in their eyes and storms in their hearts. He sees flashes of history upon the waves, sails billowing against fiery sunsets, cities rising on foreign shores, the laughter of merchants, the cries of conquest. And then, silence. When night falls, the sailor lights a single lantern at the stern of his ship. The glow is small, but it burns steady, a reminder of every soul that once braved these waters. The flame flickers against his face, revealing eyes that have seen too much, and yet still carry wonder. He knows he will never return to land. He doesn't need to. Sometimes he dreams of Lisbon. He imagines walking its steep streets again, hearing the bells of Igreja de Santa Engracia, smelling the roasted chestnuts in the cool evening air. He dreams of standing by the Belém Tower, watching ships depart into the golden distance, his heart both full and breaking. But when he wakes, all he sees is the sea, vast, endless, patient. And in that stillness, he finds peace. He knows now what those before him could not, that the true destination was never a land across the ocean, but a place within. Every voyage was a mirror, every storm a lesson. The sea was never his enemy. It was his teacher, the oldest, kindest one of all. And so he sails on, the last sailor, his lantern glowing against the dark horizon. He carries with him not maps or gold, but the quiet legacy of a people who dared to dream beyond the edge of the world. His ship drifts softly beneath the stars, and if you listen closely, on a calm night, when the wind falls still, you might hear him singing. A song of Portugal, a song of the sea, a song that never ends.
Morning rises over Lisbon, and the city glows like a pearl in the pale light. The Tagus River, calm and wide, mirrors the sky in rippling gold, and the air smells of salt, stone, and time. The bells of Alfama ring softly through the waking streets, their echoes floating across the rooftops as seagulls glide low over the harbor. The world has changed, the age of empires long gone. Yet in this moment, it feels as though every century of Portuguese history is breathing together. The light touches the water, the walls, the faces of fishermen preparing their nets, and for a fleeting instant, Lisbon looks eternal. The city remembers. Beneath its narrow lanes and tiled facades lies the heartbeat of a people who have endured every rise and fall, every storm and silence. The stones themselves seem to hum with memory, of ships departing from Belém, of crowds cheering at the docks, of distant voices carried home on the wind. But now, there is no empire to build, no conquest to chase. There is only life, quiet, steady, beautiful. The kind of peace that feels like understanding. In cafes shaded by flowering trees, old men sip their morning bica, their eyes fixed on the horizon as if still listening for sails. Musicians tune their guitars, preparing to play songs older than memory, songs of love, loss, and longing that drift through the air like ghosts made of sound. Each note seems to rise with the sun, blending with the hum of the city, the cry of gulls, the gentle lap of waves against the quay. It is a melody not of sorrow, but of gratitude for all that was and all that remains. Lisbon has always been a city of survivors. It has burned and rebuilt, fallen and risen, shaken and healed. Its beauty lies not in perfection, but in resilience, in the way light clings to cracked tiles, how laughter fills the gaps between centuries. The empire once defined it. Now, memory does. And memory, like the sea, is endless. As the day unfolds, children chase pigeons across the
squares, artists paint the waterfront, and tourists wander through the old streets, unaware that beneath their feet lie layers of forgotten worlds. But the locals know. They carry those worlds in their hearts, every voyage, every farewell, every song sung to the sea. By evening, When the sun begins to sink beyond the river, the city turns gold again. Shadows lengthen across the bridges, and the air grows still. In that glowing silence, Lisbon seems to whisper, not of loss, but of peace. The journey has come full circle. The ships have all returned, the sailors have all rested, and what remains is the light, soft, forgiving, eternal. That light is Portugal's true legacy, not the power it once wielded, but the wonder it still inspires. It shines in every story told, in every tune played, in every soul that looks at the sea and feels something stirred deep within. The Portuguese Empire may have ended, but Portugal, the dreamer, the wanderer, the poet by the water, still stands, still breathes, still listens to the ocean's song. And when night falls once more over the river, and the stars shimmer above the sleeping city, it feels as though the whole world pauses to listen. Because somewhere beneath the surface of the waves, beneath the rhythm of time itself, the story of Portugal still moves, slow, endless, luminous as the tide. There is a word the Portuguese keep close to their hearts, saudade. It is not sadness, not exactly. It is not longing, nor love alone. It is all of them at once, the sweet ache of remembering, the beauty of missing something you can never quite return to. It is the sound of the sea when the waves fall quiet, the scent of rain on stone, the echo of laughter from another time. Saudade is the soul of Portugal, invisible, yet everywhere. It lingers in the twilight between day and night, in the pause between notes of a fado song, in the way an old sailor stares out at the horizon long after the ships have gone. It is the memory of everything Portugal has ever loved, the ocean, the journeys, the faces that watched from the shore, all condensed into one tender ache. Every Portuguese carries it, knowingly or not, as part of their inheritance. It hums softly in their blood, steady as the tide. The empire may have vanished into history, but saudade remains, undiminished. It is what keeps the past alive, not as a burden, but as a comfort. It turns loss into art, distance into music, time into poetry. Every note sung in Lisbon's backstreets carries centuries of longing. Every poem written beneath a lantern's glow is a confession whispered to the sea. It is not despair, it is devotion, the kind that endures. When the Portuguese look at the sea, they do not see emptiness. They see connection, to the world, to memory, to something eternal. The same water that once carried their ancestors still kisses their shores, and in its rhythm, they hear both goodbye and return. Saudade is the echo of that rhythm, the heart remembering its own vastness. On quiet nights, when the moon hangs low over the Tagus, you can hear it most clearly, that gentle hum of centuries, a lullaby of longing that drifts through open windows and across the dark water. It's in the rustle of linen, the creak of old wood, the sigh of the wind as it moves through narrow streets. Saudade fills the air. Like perfume, unseen but unmistakable. It reminds every listener that nothing truly ends. The sailors may have vanished, the empire may have crumbled, but their dreams, their songs, their courage, still live in every wave that breaks on the shore. To feel saudade is to be alive in the deepest sense, to love so much that even absence becomes beautiful. And perhaps that is Portugal's final gift to the world. This capacity to find beauty in longing, to turn farewell into melody, to transform impermanence into art. Saudade is not sorrow. It is the promise that everything we lose still lingers, in memory, in spirit, in the endless rhythm of the sea. So listen closely, as the ocean breathes beneath the stars. You will hear it, the quietest song, born of centuries, sung by hearts that have never stopped dreaming. It is the song of saudade, the song of Portugal, eternal as the tide. The sea never forgets. Long after sails have rotted and empires have faded into dust, it remembers. Every wave that crashes against the cliffs of Sagres carries whispers of the past, of wooden ships creaking under starlight, of prayers muttered by trembling lips before voyages into the unknown, of cheers that once echoed from the harbors of Lisbon as explorers set their course toward eternity. The Atlantic, vast and patient, is Portugal's oldest witness, a mirror of its courage and its sorrow. Even now, when the world spins faster than ever, the ocean moves at its ancient rhythm, steady, eternal, unchanged. It knows no empire, no nation, no conquest. Yet it holds within its depths the dreams of all who dared to cross it. Vasco da Gama's reflection still drifts upon its surface. Magellan's ghost still lingers where the waves break against distant shores. For every Portuguese sailor who left, the sea was both the path and the promise, a way out and a way home. On calm evenings, as the sun melts into the horizon and paints the water gold, it feels as if time itself pauses. You can almost hear the faint sound of ship bells, the pull of ropes, the distant murmur of Latin prayers carried by the wind. The world of the empire, its glory, its pain, its longing, becomes a single note in a song that never truly ends. The tide carries it, from shore to shore, century after century. The sea gives and takes. It gave Portugal its empire, its wealth, its reach, its name among the stars. But it also took lives, innocence, and sometimes hope. The same horizon that promised greatness also swallowed countless ships in silence. Yet the Portuguese, perhaps more than any other people, understood that beauty and danger often share the same face. They sailed not because they were fearless, but because they believed that wonder was worth the risk. There is a kind of peace in that surrender, the acceptance that nothing we build will last forever, but that the journey itself is enough. Every tide that rises erases the footprints of the one before, yet each one leaves behind a trace, however faint, of those who dared to walk the edge of the world. Portugal's empire may be gone, but its stories, its courage, its longing, its faith, live on in the rhythm of the waves. To stand by the Atlantic now, with the wind cold against your face, is to stand in two times at once, the present and the eternal. You feel the hum of history in your bones, as if the sea itself is breathing through you. You are small, yes, but not insignificant. The same wind that carried the caravels once brushed across the same shore. The same stars that guided explorers still glimmer above. Everything changes, and yet, nothing truly does. The ocean will keep whispering. It will remember the Portuguese, the empire, the songs, the saudade. It will carry those echoes to every corner of the world, gentle, patient, infinite. Because the sea does not end, it only returns. And in its endless motion lies the truth of all empires, all dreams, all lives. We rise, we fall, we are carried forward. Portugal's story began with the tide, and with the tide, it continues. The sails are gone, but the spirit remains, rolling forever in the deep blue, bound not by land or crown, but by the eternal rhythm of the sea. The Portuguese Empire may have faded from the maps, but its voice still travels with the wind, a whisper carried across oceans and continents, alive in the rhythm of languages, in the taste of food, in the pulse of music, and in the faith of millions. The empire's ships no longer sail, yet their memory sails on in 1,000 unseen ways, from the shores of Brazil to the highlands of Angola, from the spice-scented streets of Goa to the lantern-lit harbors of Macau. Every place once touched by the Portuguese became a verse in a long and wandering song, one of trade and conquest, of sorrow and beauty, of encounter and transformation. In Brazil, the echoes of Portugal blend with the songs of Africa and the spirits of the Amazon. The language that once arrived on the lips of explorers has become a river, deep, flowing, and alive, carrying with it stories of samba, saudade, and survival. Churches rise from the heart of tropical forests, carved with symbols both Christian and indigenous. The air hums with life, color, and contradiction, all born from the meeting of worlds that began when Portuguese sails first appeared on the horizon. Across Africa, the legacy takes another form, one carved in stone forts and old coastal towns, in the call to prayer that mingles with the tolling of church bells, in the mix of bloodlines and languages that defy any single origin. Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, each carries a piece of that old empire, reshaped by time, rebellion, and resilience. What began as conquest became, over centuries, a shared and complex identity. Painful, yes, but also enduring, like the roots of a tree that keeps growing even after the storm. In Asia, the remnants of Portugal gleam like fading gold beneath the surface of history. In Goa, where the Arabian Sea breathes against ancient stones, the scent of spices still lingers in the air, mingling with incense from old cathedrals. Here, European and Indian worlds met not in harmony, but in fusion, the kind of blending that defies empire itself. In Macau, the echoes are quieter but still alive. In the tiled streets, the Baroque churches, the way a Chinese melody bends softly to the rhythm of a Portuguese fado. And through it all, the language remains the thread that binds it together, Portuguese, spoken in distant lands under different suns, carrying the memory of empire but also the freedom of reinvention. It is the world's third most spoken European language, stretching across time zones, faiths, and identities. It is no longer the tongue of kings and navigators, but of poets, singers, and dreamers who shaped it anew. This, perhaps more than any ship or crown, is the true legacy of the Portuguese Empire, not domination, but connection. A web of stories stretching across oceans, woven from both suffering and hope, reaching into the present. The empire may have sought power, but what it left behind was something far more profound, a shared human inheritance that transcends conquest. The echoes still rise at dusk, when the waves fall quiet, and the world seems to breathe as one. You can hear them in the laughter of a Brazilian festival, in the rhythm of Cape Verdean morna, in the prayer of a Goan elder, in the stillness of Lisbon's harbor at twilight. Each echo is different, yet all belong to the same ocean, the same tide, the same beginning. And perhaps that is how the Portuguese Empire truly lives on, not as a monument to empire, but as a mosaic of voices across the sea, forever speaking to one another through time.
As the sun dips behind the Tagus River, Lisbon turns gold. The city glows like an ember of the past, soft, flickering, eternal. The wind from the Atlantic carries the scent of salt and distant rain, whispering across the tiled streets and faded facades of the Alfama district. It feels as though the ghosts of sailors still walk there, boots echoing on worn stone steps, eyes turned toward the horizon where the sea meets the sky. Each wave that rolls into the harbor seems to carry with it the voices of centuries, explorers, priests, traders, slaves, and dreamers, all part of a story that began and ended here. Lisbon is quiet now, but the silence hums with memory. Down by the docks, where the great caravels once stood ready to depart, the river reflects the fading light like liquid bronze. The Belém Tower stands guard over the waters, a monument not to conquest, but to the eternal longing that drove men beyond the edge of the map. The Geronimo's monastery nearby, with its lace-like stonework, breathes the same solemn prayer. We reached the ends of the earth, and still we searched for more. It is a beauty tinged with melancholy, a pride shadowed by loss. In the narrow streets, where laundry hangs from windows and fado songs spill from taverns, you can hear the soul of Portugal, that deep, aching music of longing and remembrance called saudade. It's more than sadness. It's a yearning for something gone yet never truly lost. It is the empire's echo, softened by time. The people sing not of kings or battles, but of love, of sea voyages, of the endless dance between departure and return. And in those songs, the empire breathes again, not as a tale of dominion, but as a reflection of humanity's restless heart. The empire that once stretched across oceans has folded back into itself. The power is gone, but the stories remain, written in stone, spoken in language, carried in blood. In the faces of Lisbon's people, you can see the world, Africa, Brazil, India, the East, all mixed into one. The Portuguese Empire may have fallen, but its dream of connection never died. It simply changed shape, finding new life in culture, music, and memory. As night settles over the city, the bells of old churches toll softly. Lanterns flicker in the windows. The sound of the river mingles with the murmurs of the crowd, and somewhere, a singer begins a slow, mournful fado. The lyrics drift into the night air like prayer. The sea gave us everything and took it all away. The empire ended, but its soul, that longing to explore, to understand, to reach beyond the known, still burns quietly in the heart of Portugal. And so, the story of the Portuguese Empire does not truly end. It lives in every harbor and every heart that still looks toward the horizon and wonders what lies beyond.
It lives in every word of the Portuguese language whispered in distant lands, in every song that rises against the wind. The caravels may have vanished, but their spirit remains, timeless as the tides. The waves strike the shore, steady and endless. The city listens, remembering. Somewhere beyond the mist, the stars shimmer like the eyes of sailors lost to the sea, watching, guiding, waiting. The world has changed, but their journey continues, in all of us who still dream of the unknown. So, as you drift to sleep tonight, let the sound of the ocean carry you, through the centuries, across the waves, to the edge of the world where Portugal's dream first began. The sea is calm now. The empire sleeps, but its story will never fade.